Okay, a very good afternoon to everyone here. Warm welcome to all of you who have joined the AWS 2022 Sustainability Summit today. My name is Junice Yo, Executive Director at EcoBusiness, and I'm very delighted to be a host for today's session. Now, the theme for this year's session, Meeting Sustainability and Climate Goals with the Cloud, is a timely one. As technology continues to reshape our post-pandemic world, the window for action to prevent the worst effects of climate change is rapidly narrowing. Businesses and governments everywhere are faced with the important challenge of collectively reducing emissions despite the burgeoning demand for data. And while we are aware of the mounting challenges in carbon reduction, our summit today will focus on solutions. Cloud infrastructure has come a long way in enabling efficiencies to be achieved, even with ever greater volumes of IT workloads. As such, we have prepared today a great lineup of experts who will hail from regional governments, businesses, and organizations. They will be sharing their insights on what we term as the twin transition, in which the evolution of cloud infrastructure efficiency and maximizing decarbonization opportunities in the cloud are now becoming mutually reinforcing. Today's session is meant to be as interactive and as lively as possible. Questions are welcomed via the chat box, and if we have, we have our team on standby to moderate and address them. We will also have a post-webinar survey to get your feedback and suggestions. And I know many of you are keen to take notes throughout the session, so don't you worry. You will receive a post-event report, which will be sent to you, assuming you have registered with us. All right, just a heads up on the sound bites to come this afternoon. First, our panel that will zoom straight into the heart of the main topic, led by my colleague, Jessica Cham. She will be leading the panel to explore the challenges and opportunities in the twin transition of digital transformation and decarbonization. We will also be hearing from a leading AWS partner, Alpha Beta and Access Partnerships, who will take us through the latest findings from its Singapore case study. Singapore's use of data services across its healthcare, finance, and social services is expected to grow 4 times by 2030. At this important juncture, designing the most sustainable data centers for the future of its digital economy is critical for Singapore's government and its regional status. Our final panel will focus on the power and utility sector. Led by AWS's Ms. Genevieve Ding, we will be joined by its leading partners who will delve a little deeper into how they are achieving key sustainability outcomes in their own businesses, leveraging the power of cloud. Lots of insights await us this afternoon. So without further ado, allow me to kick off today's summit officially. First up, it is my pleasure to introduce to you Ms. Quint Simon, Director, Global Public Policy, AWS. She will be providing to us her welcome remarks for today. Quint, the floor is yours.
I'm honored to welcome everyone to today's summit focused on meeting sustainability and climate goals with the cloud. The digitalization of both businesses and government have transformed economies, lowered costs, accelerated innovation, and improved services for citizens. In fact, due to the COVID-19 pandemic, businesses accelerated their digitalization efforts to protect employees and better serve end customers. According to a McKinsey Global Survey in 2020, companies have accelerated the digitalization of their supply chain and internal operations by 3 to 4 years as a result of the pandemic. Contrary to some beliefs, the twin transitions of digitization and decarbonization are not mutually exclusive, but in fact, mutually beneficial. Governments across APAC can turn these parallel challenges into mutual opportunities by harnessing the demand for digitization to meet pressing climate commitments. At AWS, we strongly believe cloud technology has a crucial role to play in accelerating both digital transformation and green economic recovery. Sustainability is top of mind for Amazon. In 2019, we co-founded the Climate Pledge, a commitment to be net zero carbon by 2040, 10 years early than the Paris Agreement. We've since been joined by over 300 organizations and companies who have made the same ambitious commitment. One of the biggest ways in which we are focused on meeting our net zero carbon goal is by addressing emissions from our energy use. To this end, we are always looking first for how we can increase the efficiency of our facilities, as we know the cleanest energy we can use is that which we don't have to use in the first place. These investments are already paying dividends. According to a recent survey of 500 enterprises and public sector organizations across the Asia Pacific region by 451 Research, for the average organization, moving computing workloads from on-premise data centers to the cloud today would reduce the carbon footprint associated with running IT workloads by nearly 80%. And that's just from energy efficiency gains alone. And that value goes even higher when we are able to purchase 100% renewable energy, which Amazon is on a path to achieve across our global business operations by 2025, 5 years earlier than our original goal of 2030. In APAC, our utility scale solar and wind project investments in Australia, China, Singapore, and most recently Japan are bringing brand new approaches, associated capital, and green jobs and technology across the region. We've also committed to an initial $2 billion under the Climate Pledge Fund to invest in the development of innovative, sustainable, and decarbonization technologies and services, including investing in companies like CarbonCure, whose low carbon concrete we are using in our new data center builds to literally address the embodied carbon of our facilities from the ground up. Aside from making our own infrastructure more sustainable, we are accelerating sustainable transformation by providing the cloud-based tools and services that will help public sector organizations decarbonize and achieve more sustainability outcomes. And we are committed to becoming an even better partner to governments and businesses to help transform how they operate sustainably. Earlier this year, we co-launched a report with SG Tech and Alpha Beta entitled Green Data, the Sustainable Data Center Opportunity for Singapore, showing how industry and governments work closely together to achieve an ideal green growth model, which accelerates strong expansion of data centers without compromising Singapore's ambitious sustainability goals, especially important for a country that takes its carbon emissions targets so seriously. At the launch of this paper, we were heartened to see the cross-industry response, with seemingly the entire DC industry aligned in wanting to work together with the Singapore government to promote greener data center sustainability. Later in today's event, we'll hear from Dr. Fraser Thompson from Access Partnership, who will discuss how some of these lessons can be translated across the APAC region. Crucial to governments in APAC is reaching net zero carbon by 2050. This will be achieved by data-driven, cloud-enabled solutions coupled with scaled, direct investments in clean energy and decarbonizing technologies. This could involve enabling cloud service providers like AWS to bring their investments to bear on expanding renewable energy availability and affordability, something that we have worked on really closely with other corporate buyers to achieve in countries like India via the Renewable Energy Demand Enhancement Initiative, where we were thrilled to see the recent announcement that the Indian government is enabling open access and lowering barriers to corporate renewable energy purchases in other ways as well. Harnessing digital transformation to promote decarbonization could also involve efforts to promote green access to and use of data-driven, cloud-enabled solutions for all sectors of society, as seen in New Zealand and Singapore, and from organizations like the Asian Development Bank, all of whom will be sharing their perspectives on our first panel discussion. And as we will hear more directly from Japan's digital minister, Karen Makishima, immediately after this. We believe that governments across APAC have much to gain in continued collaboration with industry, as we very much look forward to co-innovating solutions to help governments and economies transform sustainably as they develop their energy and climate policies to make progress on their commitments. A report by the International Energy Agency, the IEA, last year found that one of the most transformative roles that cloud can play is to accelerate the sustainability innovation process itself. According to the IEA, cloud-enabled technologies like artificial intelligence, machine learning, Internet of Things, and edge computing will be critical to accelerating systemic transformations at scale. As we'll hear in the final section of today's event, this is the most tangible in the energy and utility sectors already. In electricity retail services in Japan, Trendy is using the cloud in innovative ways to quickly expand solar power offerings and establish peer-to-peer electricity trading for Japanese residential customers. In power grid management in Australia and New Zealand, Vector, a transmission and distribution company, is using cloud-enabled IoT, ML, and big data analytics to facilitate efficient grid management and greater integration of clean energy. And in India, Greenco is contributing to decarbonizing India's grid and enabling more use of renewable resources there by using the cloud and data to drive better outcomes. We are so pleased to dive deeper into these pioneering cases during the summit today. It's all about moving forward together. The Asia-Pacific region can benefit from collaboration between government and industry to meet the shared objective of promoting best-in-class data center efficiency, sustainability, and ultimately inclusive growth for all. I am now honored to have Japan's Digital Minister, Karen Makishina, open the summit today by sharing some highlights on the Japanese government's efforts on digitalization with cloud. She will also be sharing her thoughts on how sustainability and digital technologies can be mutually beneficial. Minister Makishima has been Japan's Minister of Digital Agency and its Minister of Digital Reform since October 2021. Thank you for joining us today, and I look forward to today's discussions. Thank you.
Hello everyone, my name is Makishima Karen, and I'm Minister in charge of Digital, Administrative Reform and Regulatory Reform for Government of Japan. I am honored to have this opportunity as a keynote speech at AWS Sustainability Summit to introduce Japan's initiatives on digitalization and regulatory reform to transform Japan into a decarbonized society. Let me start by introducing the current Japan's efforts on digitalization. In Japan, in response to the spread of COVID-19 infections, various issues around digitalization were revealed in both public and private sectors, such as administrative inefficiencies resulting from insufficient system coordination between government agencies. This came from various reasons. First, systems at national and local governments were not well connected and not sufficiently coordinated. Second, administrative rules and systems for emergency support were dispersed across multiple administrative agencies. Lastly, there was insufficient cross-ministry collaboration in data use. There was common recognition that Japan could lag behind global trends of digitalizations and lose international competitiveness if it continues to take ad hoc and patchwork measures and does not embrace the growing development of digital technology. Based on that recognition, on September 1st, 2021, Digital Agency was established as a command tower for the formation of a digital society in Japan. Since the establishment of Digital Agency, it has formulated priority policy program for realizing digital society. Digital Agency is working towards the realization of the society where no one will be left behind and all residents can enjoy the benefits of digital technology. As described in Priority Plan, I believe the importance of utilizing digital technology to realize a well-being and a sustainable environment, society, and economy, and to promote safe, secure, and clean community. In order to realize a digital society, Japan should proactively use cloud technology based on the cloud by default policy. This results in the promoting the government cloud. Government cloud is the common platform for cloud use by central and local governments. By maximizing the benefits of cloud services, government clouds aims to help develop fast, flexible, secure, and cost-efficient systems for national and local governments, and to quickly provide and improve highly convenient services for users. We put the vision for the Digital Garden City Nation, which is the new vision for each local area, that fully benefits from digital technology and provides convenience and attractiveness while preserving the abundance of the local areas. To promote this vision, we need to ensure infrastructures such as networks and servers. We also need to ensure the interoperability of services in all fields, such as education, healthcare, agriculture, tourism, and logistics, which come into contact with every aspect of daily life and develop digital infrastructure as an open data collaboration platform. We are working hard to address these issues. It is also important to use the digital infrastructure for a sustainable regional industry with the participation of the public and private sectors and academics. Only when there is a vibrant industry, well-being can be improved and attractive areas can be created. We will build an ecosystem in which industries that address local problems can grow and expand their businesses into the world. The mission of Digital Agency is to create people-friendly digitalized society where no one will be left behind. Digital Agency is working on designing an administrative service based on the principles of user-centeredness and human-centeredness to realize a digital society where each resident can choose services that satisfy their demands and achieve various happiness through digital technology. One major infrastructure supporting the realization of this principle is My Number system, a system under which each resident is assigned a unique number and administrative services such as tax and social security are provided based on that number. This system has been expanded to provide one-step services for searching and online applications for administrative procedures such as childcare and nursing care. To enable residents to receive these services more conveniently and efficiently, the government promotes My Number Card with electronic certificate as an online identity verification tool. The latest project of using this My Number system is the registration of bank and savings accounts to receive various benefits. While the whole world had to respond to the unprecedented situation of the coronavirus, our country also provided emergency benefits to residents. That previous procedure required residents to apply their account information to the local government each time. However, by having this account information registered with the central government in advance, the local government can provide emergency and social security and other benefits quickly. We believe that reviewing the way the government provides administrative services while utilizing these digital infrastructures will contribute to creating the sustainable society. Alongside digitalization, another pressing issue for Japan is to actualize a decarbonized society. Climate change is the common challenge for all humanity, and we need to tackle with the issue not only in Japan but also in the Asia-Pacific region and ultimately across the globe. Japan is working towards achieving carbon neutrality by 2050. Japan aims to reduce its greenhouse gas emissions by 46% in 2030 compared to 2013 level. We are committed to continuing our efforts to reach 50% reduction. In the pursuit of social sustainability, not only governments but also companies need to make sustainability efforts to realize a low-carbon or a decarbonized society. We also need to change our mindset and view that achieving a green society is not a constraint of the economy. Rather, it is a major transformation of the social economy that fosters investment, increases productivity, and produces the major shift in the industrial structure and strong economic growth. To actualize decarbonized society, sustainability efforts and technologies will be crucial and an inseparable pair. Since the 2010s, digital transformation has become an integral part of business growth. The transition to sustainable society through digital technologies will transform business strategy over the next decade. Numerous examples of green transformation have emerged with use of technologies such as cloud computing. For instance, examples have already emerged in the aviation sector, where machine learning has been used to select optimal aviation routes and reduce fuel consumption. In the energy sector, IoT and analytical tools have been used to efficiently distribute renewable energy across the power grid. The transformation of renewable energy into a main power source and maximum use of the clean energy are key to realize a carbon-neutral society by 2050. I believe it essential to comprehensively review the regulations that act as barriers to this effort. In order to realize speedy regulatory reforms to expand the use of renewable energy, Japanese government established task force for a comprehensive review of regulations on renewable energy under my leadership. Task force is working on regulatory reforms to expand the introduction of offshore wind power and to promote renewable energy in public facilities. Task force is also discussing measures to utilize technologies to expand the introduction of renewable energy. In some cases, the review of regulations and systems in line with the digital age has already helped to boost the spread of renewable energy. In the past, monthly inspections of solar power plants involved on-site visual checks for dirt, damage, deformation, and corrosion of solar panels and cables. Since April 2021, this regulation has been revised to allow inspections using remote monitoring technology such as data acquisition systems using surveillance cameras and sensors. And the review of regulations and systems in line with the digital age will contribute not only to promote renewable energy but also to improve operational efficiency in all administrative and economic activities. This will resolve the issues of workforce shortages, improve productivity, and increase income. To this end, in December last year, Japan formulated the digital principles. Digital principles state that procedures and tasks that require written, visual, station, or on-site audits should be completed by digital procedures and automated by machines as the basis for end-to-end digital compliance, including within the government. Discussions are underway to review more than 40,000 existing laws and regulations in the light of these digital principles. Approximately 4,000 provisions have already been reviewed as part of the plan for mass overhaul of regulations in line with digital principles. The formulation of this plan is not a goal but a start, and we will discuss further to wipe out analog regulations in the next 3 years. In the pursuit of digital society where no one will be left behind, we acknowledge that there are people who are not good at digital technology and at the latest technological trends and who are confused by new developments in the world. Today, we are creating an environment throughout the country where people can learn how to use digital devices, technologies, and services from people close to them and familiar places. By supporting such people in dealing with digital and technology and by calling attention to the fact that such support initiatives are available. The people leading this national movement are digital supporters. We believe that The warm efforts of digital supporters can improve convenience in local communities through the advancement of digitalization and technology, thereby realizing a well-being and sustainable society. Japan must achieve both the digital society, where no one will be left behind, and a carbon-neutral society by 2050, without lacking in either of them. I hope the further use of digital technology, including cloud, will accelerate the realization of the sustainable green society. I look forward to a lively discussion among the participants at this event today, so that we can be leaders in promoting both digitalization and sustainability. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Karen-san, for providing us with your perspectives from Japan. Very valuable key initiatives where no one will be left behind. All right, before we move to the main panel, I'd like to remind anyone who's listening in who may require interpretation. We have a total of 4 other languages: Japanese, Korean, Thai, as well as Bahasa Indonesia. And if you'd like for the session to be translated to yourself, for your ears, you can just click on the button below that says interpretation, and you can choose the language where you need. Okay, all right. All right, so now I'm delighted to introduce our highly anticipated panel discussion, Reaching Net Zero Emissions, Challenges and Opportunities for Combining Decarbonization and Digital Transformation. And Jessica, the founder and managing director of EcoBusiness, will be the moderator for this panel. So I'm going to leave it to her good hands now to run the show. Jessica, over to you.
Thank you very much, Junice, and thank you, AWS Institute, for this partnership and for convening this important discussion today. The topic of our panel this afternoon focuses on reaching net zero emissions, challenges and opportunities for combining decarbonization and digital transformation. We've heard from our opening speakers, Quinn and Karen-san, on how this twin transition in cloud-enabled digital transformation, as well as decarbonization, is mutually beneficial. Particularly encouraging are Japan's leadership in various initiatives on decarbonizing its economy and the use of technologies such as machine learning and remote monitoring to enable this. I'm delighted to be able to convene this panel of distinguished speakers who will now be able to delve into details on the challenges and opportunities that confront us in this particular journey. So I'd love to introduce them now, if they can all turn on their cameras and join us. And they are Dr. Amelia Sharman, Director of Climate Standards at the New Zealand External Reporting Board. We have Mr. Heng Jianwei, Director of Planning and Policy at Singapore's National Climate Change Secretariat. We also have Mr. Stephen Peters, Senior Energy Specialist, Sustainable Development and Climate Change Department at the Asian Development Bank, as well as Mr. Ken Haig, Chair of the Asia Cloud Computing Association Sustainability Working Group, as well as the AWS Head of Energy and Environment Policy, APAC. Thank you all speakers for joining us this afternoon. I'm super excited to be able to convene this conversation. I'd also like to add that we will be taking some questions later on. So for our guests today, please do send them through in the chat box on our platform. Right, we have a lot of ground to cover. So to start us off, I'd like to pose the first question to all our panelists today. What, in your view, is the biggest challenge for APAC economies in reaching net zero emissions? And in the tradition of ladies first, I'd like to invite Amelia to share her thoughts.
Thank you very much, Jessica. It's fantastic to be here today to speak with you all. So I think one of the things I would like to highlight as a key challenge facing APAC economies is the capital. There is enough private and public capital out there to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. However, the key challenge is redirecting it to the right investments and away, towards low emissions investments and away from high emissions investments and activities. And that's where the work of the External Reporting Board in New Zealand and others around the world comes in on disclosure, making sure that those climate-related risks and opportunities are properly factored in now to investment decisions and enabling the realization that investing in a low emissions future will actually be the least costly approach in the long term. And I think it's important to point out that many investment decisions are also made using existing models of risk, and they don't factor in the substantial increase in risk that climate change represents. So, for example, an infrastructure investment that uses a current weather pattern to identify a risk of, say, a 1 in X 100-year flood or drought. So instead of factoring in the reality of, say, a 1 in 20-year flood in a very highly likely 1.5 degree world, decision makers are still using current estimates of, say, a 1 in 100 or a 1 in 200-year flood event or a drought event based on a 1 degree or less world. So I think better information will inevitably lead to better decisions and faster achievement of net zero.
Thank you so much, Amelia, for those perspectives, and I'll come back to it. I'd like to invite Jian Wei to give the perspective from the Singapore government.
Thanks, Jessica. Yeah, so maybe before we talk about the challenges, I was going to say that what is plus is that the climate ambition across APAC economies have grown significantly the last 2 years. So there are increasing number of countries as well as their companies that meet net zero pledges in this time period. And I think it's something that we should be quite happy and excited about. But that said, there are challenges, and I can start with Singapore first. So for Singapore, I think we are interestingly an outlier in the region. We are very high density. We have a very small land mass, and we are alternative energy disadvantaged. Maybe I elaborate a little bit about that. So the only renewable energy resource in Singapore is solar, and solar unfortunately is land intensive, which is not something that plays well to our small land space. So that's indeed challenging for us. For the region, on the other hand, I think it is quite a different challenge. I think Amelia pointed to some of them, and for a start, the region has a much larger endowment in the potential renewable energy projects that can be developed. The problem, I think, is that today, not all of these projects are currently bankable yet. So the economics aren't quite working out for private and public funds to flow into them. So I think there is a need to see how we can make the economics work out. I don't think it's about the land, but it's about understanding how we can get an economic model that may make sense for investments to flow in. And once that happens, I think this is a large potential that can be unlocked from the resources in our region.
Thank you so much, Jian Wei. And I think we'll come back to the capital question there, but Steve, would like to invite you to share your perspective. Steve, you're on mute.
Oh, how terribly embarrassing. Thanks, Jess. Thanks, Jian Wei. I'm glad you brought up the ambition word, because everybody seems to be pushing hard on ambition. But from where I sit and what I've seen, I think confidence is actually a big issue. And you mentioned bankability. I think it's still a bit confusing for people. They're trying to navigate through and keep the lights on and keep people working. And I know that we need to get off fossil fuels. We need to decarbonize and displace. It's very hard to do. And so especially trying to keep, economies and societies moving forward. So I think my word would be confidence. And I draw an example. Jian Wei, you talked about being land renewables. Ireland did a recent study, and they found out that Ireland is actually 9/10 sea. And if you look at states in the Pacific, they're sort of like 99.9% sea and 0.1% land. So we're doing some work on trying to identify sources of natural capital in the ocean and using ocean energy and using ocean resources, but doing it in a way that we're not stripping stuff out of it, but regenerating it. That actually has been a real challenge for us to get people to consider it, because it's the mindset is that we've always done stuff with diesel and we've always done it on land. So it goes to, people have got to move, but how fast they move and keep everything working is the big challenge. So my word's confidence, and I'll hand back to you, Jess. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Steve, for that perspective. Ken, perhaps I can get you to share your thoughts. You have a bird's eye view of the region. What in your view, do you think is kind of like the biggest obstacle?
Yeah, well, I love the optimism that we're seeing here with ambition and confidence. I would share Genway's assessment that the good news today is that governments and industries across the region are showing increasing ambition. So, the number of countries that have 2050 net zero carbon goals includes not just New Zealand and Singapore, who are on the panel here today, but now Australia, South Korea, Japan, to Minister Makishima's address earlier, and even Vietnam here in the APAC region. And then you've got, obviously countries like China and India and Indonesia, who are big emitters that are not far behind. So I would say that, first of all, the ambition that we're seeing is great to see. And that's something that I think has historically been a challenge, but now we're seeing greater ambition. The next challenge is how to get there, right? So there's just, I think the bad news, I guess, is that even particularly given the rapidly narrowing window for averting the worst impacts of the climate crisis, there's still a lack of common clarity on how to achieve these targets. And this is something I spend a lot of time thinking about and working with regional policymakers on as a part of my day job. So normally I'm APAC head of energy and environmental policy for AWS, along with Genevieve Ding, who you'll hear from later today. But I'm here today with my Asia Cloud Computing Association hat on. And the reason for that is because we've just launched a paper at the ACCA on how the cloud can help to address sustainable development goals today. And so this includes use cases for all 17 of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. And I look forward to delving into some of those lessons learned from the paper, because I do think those are steps that we can take today to very clearly make steps towards achieving net zero carbon goals. So thanks for the opportunity.
Thanks so much, Ken, and I'll take you up on that, delve into the cloud and SDGs specifically. But before that, perhaps we can frame this conversation with a regulatory perspective. I think all of you had mentioned that the ambition from governments is something that's really encouraging that we've seen in the region. And of course, regulation is key to providing the right environment for decarbonizing technologies to thrive. So from the regulatory perspective, what do you think governments are doing to enable this net zero pathway? And I think what are some of the, the challenges that governments face in doing that? And perhaps I can get Amelia to share first from the New Zealand perspective.
Absolutely. So we have a huge amount of activity going on in New Zealand at the moment. New Zealand has recently released a draft national adaptation plan. We have released emissions budgets, and we have released an associated emissions reduction plan to go with those emissions budgets. So huge amount of activity. And at the XRB, the External Reporting Board, we are the national standard setter. We have been developing accounting and assurance standards for about 10 years and have been recently given a mandate to develop mandatory climate-related disclosures. We're really excited about it, one of the first countries in the world to introduce a mandatory system. So those mandatory disclosures are going to apply to about 200 of our largest entities. On the one hand, listed entities on the New Zealand Stock Exchange with a market capitalization of New Zealand $60 million or greater. So quite small compared to some of the entities that are captured in, say, the US proposals for climate-related disclosures. And then on the other hand, our large financial institutions, so our banks, insurers, Crown financial institutions, so our large superannuation funds, for example, and fund managers. And what they're going to require are disclosures, climate-related disclosures under that broad task force on climate-related financial disclosures framework of governance, strategy, risk management, and metrics and targets. However, they have also been influenced by the draft International Sustainability Standards Board climate standard, which is currently out for consultation. Our standards we're expecting to issue at the end of this year. They're coming out for consultation, our final consultation round in a month. So if you have any comments on our consultation, please have a look at our website. We're very keen for understanding how they will go down both in New Zealand and around the world. And they will, if we issue in December this year, they will come into force immediately. So for reporting periods beginning 1 January 2023. So we will be starting to see our first climate statements in 2024. So we're very excited about it. We think there's a huge amount of information that will be of value to our primary users, our investors. However, there are still a lot of challenges, as you pointed out, Jessica. So, for example, data availability. We don't want lack of data to get in the way of good disclosures. There's a lot that can be done qualitatively, but we are, very aware that good data would make disclosure easier. And also capability and capacity. These regimes are new. There's a lot of upskilling that needs to happen, both internally in these entities and also in the investor communities to understand the information that's coming out and to be able to make better investment decisions. But we're working on these. One of the things that we are doing in New Zealand at the XRB is encouraging entities to come together in their broad sector groupings, so their industry sector groupings, to work on the creation of scenarios collectively. What that means is that it is more resource efficient for these entities, and also it enables better comparability across entities and across sectors. So we've got some of our sectors, our banking sector, insurance sector, for example, starting on that collective process. And then those scenarios will be able to be used by individual reporting entities in their disclosures. So watch this space, lots going on.
Thank you so much, Amelia, and also for New Zealand's leadership in terms of making mandatory climate disclosures, because obviously you can't improve what you don't measure. And I think a lot of companies are coming under pressure for disclosing and therefore, putting in place strategies to decarbonize. And I think the next step really is the auditing of ESG data. You talked about data availability, but then also the quality and the veracity of that data is super important. So thanks for sharing that perspective. Perhaps I can go to Jian Wei from the Singapore government perspective.
Thanks. I just want to support Amelia in climate disclosures. I think it's a very important move, and I think the space is evolving, and I think standards are changing. So it's not the easiest to navigate because the lay of the land keeps changing. But I think it's important work that will put us in good state in the longer term. I think the other and that's something that Singapore has moved quite recently is to right price carbon. I think carbon is an externality. If you are able to price the externality correctly, it will change business behavior in what do you call that, free market fashion, because that changes the way they make assessments, make investment decisions, etc. And this is not new, because I know many companies today have internal carbon prices or shadow carbon prices that they factor in for their own investments. So for Singapore, in February this year, we made an announcement to raise our carbon tax to 50 to 80 Singapore dollars, which is about 35 to 55 US dollars by 2030. And this will create the policy environment to encourage new green investments, as well as for companies to pursue investments that will support decarbonization. And this is challenging because it creates transitional challenges. Singapore has a fairly large industry sector that produces for the region and the world. So even as we look at putting in place a carbon tax, we also want to try to support some of these investments and existing investments that are already here in Singapore, invested in a different climate. They are here for 20 years ago, and that's a very different Singapore. And I think what we are trying to do is find a smoother glide path, provide some kind of support in the interim, but at the same time not blunt the marginal price, so that they also make the same investments. And then I think if they make these investments, it will be helpful to bring Singapore to a low carbon future. So that's really what we are trying to strive at. It's not a very easy balance, but I think it's an important one to take. Just speaking on carbon prices, I was going to say that while Singapore has our own carbon tax, I think not every country in our region is pricing carbon yet. I think some are. I think Indonesia is making some moves, for instance, but not every country is doing so. I think if more countries do so, I think it will actually create the momentum a little bit faster. I know it's not easy. I think Steve spoke about, if you're trying to keep your lights on, it's not so easy to be able to then talk about decarbonization in the same breath. But I think at the same time, it's quite important to right price this externality, because there are costs, as Amelia said, and I think it's important to try to price these costs in. I'm not sure if we can move towards single carbon price for the region or the world, probably not anytime soon. But I think as something that will support, regional decarbonization, probably an important step to at least work towards. I just want to talk a little bit about other policies in Singapore, and I take the point that not everything can work through a free market perspective. I think one such example we realized is our shift towards cleaner vehicles. So Singapore has a 2040 target where we want 100% cleaner vehicles, at least passenger vehicles. And as we made the target, we realized that one key gap in Singapore is charging infrastructure. Because if you're living in a countryside or somewhere with more landed housing, it's quite easy to install chargers in your own homes. However, most of Singaporeans live in apartments, and when you live in apartments, it's not so straightforward to install chargers. So to help us move towards our target of 100% cleaner vehicles by 2040, we have put in place policies to increase the number of chargers, especially amongst housing estates, such that we have 60,000 chargers by 2030. And I think a move like this will help bridge some of the market failures and ensure that indeed we can move towards cleaner vehicles and cleaner Singapore. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Jian Wei, for that reminder about the carbon price and really kind of setting the right tone for pricing externalities. And it is encouraging to see in the region that we're starting to see more of these policies come in, and also the efforts of governments actually leading where charging infrastructure and public infrastructure is concerned. I think that's super important. Coming to Steve, I want to hear from you. How do you think digital transformation and technology is helping with the green transition in APAC? I think in your role, you've seen a lot of projects, that the ADB is funding, for example. Have you seen any great examples that you can share with our guests today?
I can actually share you three. So we've actually got three areas where we've actually had interventions, and they're in different parts of the value chain. So for instance, we had a competition in 2020 at the start of COVID, looking at how digital apps could change the way people interact with waste. And there's been a lot of excellent startups around the region trying to apply the Uber or Gojek type model to waste. And we ran a competition, and we were surprised by how much content there was. So we just we've got a firm that won that, and we've been supporting them to write a document which we'll share amongst our government partners. So part of our job is to help government and give government information. Another area which we've been working on is how to help governments simulate their waste supply chain. And what we've been finding is that a lot of governments are moving towards large waste to energy projects, and they have a desire to do those, and they've been convinced that they may be a good idea. And so what we had to do is put together, at the request of one developing member country, a model that would allow us to say, well, if we have 3,000 tonnes of waste a day, how much of it should go to recycling, how much should go to biogas, how much should go to a waste to energy plant. And we figured out that there are about 200 different parameters across over 100 interventions. And the interventions like putting in a resource recovery facility, using an app, putting in a waste to energy plant, putting in a biogas plant. And we ran some simulations. We're just finalizing that tool. We're calling it Warps. I'll put the tool in the link after I've finished speaking. And that will then allow us to make decisions about how much carbon there is, and more importantly, things like persistent organic pollutants. And the POPs are a huge issue, because the base case for most of our countries, not Singapore obviously, is that waste is dumped on an uncontrolled landfill and regularly catches fire. And so that's the base case. And we're trying to say, well, how can we incrementally get off that and get to something cleaner and more efficient, and obviously with less pollution. And then the final thing, which is Ken and I are talking a bit about, is how do we use artificial intelligence to capture all of the data? Amelia was talking about an enormous amount of data. We have an enormous amount of data about, flyways, national parks, wind speed, solar radiance, all of these things. We can actually determine and plan where we put infrastructure. I talked a little bit about offshore energy infrastructure. We're looking at applying that to say, well, for instance, a country like the Marshall Islands, where we're working at the moment, where are the areas where you could do this, and what would be the cost, and what would be the economics, and then simulate that and give some data to that. Now, what that means is that governments can say, oh, this might be an area we should develop for our offshore wind, or this should be an area for floating solar, or we might be able to put a fish farm with it, or we may be able to do coastal defences to help us mitigate the impact of climate change. But also we get information about natural capital. So then we can actually start inferring what's the natural capital. So when you look at, I'm using New Zealand as an example. I'm a resident of Singapore, so I better not do that. I'll use New Zealand as an example. New Zealand's famous for its beauty, but New Zealand has an enormous amount of ocean space as well. And the natural capital of that ocean space will be significant. And again, that natural capital is something people can lend off against. So we're very excited about the work we're trying to do with AI, and hopefully AWS will help us with our natural capital lab, not with our AI lab, which they're developing with us collaboratively. So I'll hand it back to you.
Thank you so much, Steve. And at this point, I feel like I need to invite Ken to share some perspectives on that, on the use of technology here.
Yeah, thanks. So that just launched ACCA paper that I mentioned earlier has 4 overarching calls to action. And the first is that the cloud computing industry in Asia-Pacific region needs to continue to demonstrate commitment to minimizing the carbon and environmental footprint of our cloud infrastructure. We can do this through demonstrable efforts and targets. We can also do so through clear collaboration with regional stakeholders, regional governments, to ensure that the focus is on promoting data center sustainability wherever possible. So the first one is around sustainable infrastructure. The second point goes back to what Quint raised earlier, and I was pleased to hear Minister Makishima mention as well. There are a lot of companies like AWS that have 100% renewable energy goals that unfortunately it's still very difficult to meet in parts of the Asia-Pacific region. And that's leaving a lot of decarbonization potential on the table, which is frustrating because we want to get in, we want to invest, we want to grow markets for renewable energy, but there are still many barriers to doing so. So the second point that the ACCA paper makes is that governments in APAC should immediately help corporate renewable energy investments and expand market options for renewable energy procurement. That's a no-brainer, no regrets move to help enable expansion of market capital for renewable energy. The third point, this is again going back to what Quint mentioned around the cleanest energy that we can use is that which we don't have to use in the first place. Our highest order priority should always be on promoting energy efficiency. And this is the second year that we've done this AWS Sustainability Summit. We heard last year from 451 Research at the same event that investments in this space are paying dividends. Quint mentioned this as well. If you look at that 500 survey of over 500 public sector and enterprise organizations across APAC, we know already that there's at least a 5 times increase in energy efficiency from moving the IT workloads from on-premises data centers into highly efficient cloud data centers. So that's something we can do today and remove 80% of the carbon footprint associated with running those IT workloads. The last point that the ACCA paper makes, and I think this is perhaps the most important one, is that the application of cloud computing can help governments and industries achieve progress on their sustainable development goals today. I think that when we think about SDGs, sometimes these are really complex problems that can seem insurmountable, but in fact, there's actually a lot of good low-hanging fruit that we can start to address today simply by making good use of data and cloud-enabled tools. And Steve mentioned a few great examples a second ago. I mentioned that ACCA paper, we've got all 17 of the goals. The one that jumps out to me, and which we'll hear more about later, is SDG 7, affordable and clean energy. Great examples from utilities about how they're already leveraging data to run more efficient grids, integrate more distributed energy resources, clean energy technologies. I'm looking forward to hearing more on that. But there's also a lot on climate action. So this is SDG 13. We have at AWS the Amazon Sustainability Data Initiative, which is enabling not only open access and free use of massive amounts of climate data and data sets, but also fully cloud-powered model simulations for running climate models. And this is great because it's accelerating climate research, it's democratizing climate science, expanding access to climate-related research and tools. So this is really important for climate. It's also important for preventing environmental degradation and biodiversity loss on land and at sea. So these are SDGs 14 and 15. Some great examples that are highlighted in the ACCA paper. OSearch, this is a group that's using satellite telemetry data and making these available via open source to enable better, more sustainable fisheries management. Or on land, there's the Elephant Listening Project, which recorded and uses over machine learning to analyze over 1 million hours of acoustic recordings of elephant populations around the world. And what this is doing is it's helping conservation groups combat illegal poaching. So these are just a few examples of how cloud technologies can help to address some of these thorny sustainability challenges, but with little or no setup. These are solutions that we can share today and scale quickly. So would definitely encourage folks interested in this to go and look at the ACCA paper to get some more ideas on that front. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Ken. Super fascinating. And I think we can share the link of that very interesting ACCA paper to all our guests here today. I want to pick up something on you mentioned about government action on, expanding RE options. And obviously that is a very low hanging fruit that we can see in the region. And perhaps more broadly, I want to talk about successful private public partnership projects. And perhaps, I'll just throw this out to all of the panelists. What successful examples have you seen in the APAC region of this public-private partnership that's enabled companies, corporations, organizations to get on this net zero pathway? Steve.
Yeah, thanks, Jess. You saw me warming up to go. India had a fantastic project in a program in Rajasthan to build solar parks, and we recently had a very successful rollout in Cambodia building solar parks, and the price per kilowatt of solar produced on standard commercial activities was about 8 to 9 cents a kilowatt hour about 7 years ago. We've now got to 3 cents and lower by working with government, where government can, the Ministry of Mines and Energy in Cambodia, where we can de-risk the development of the park. So effectively saying, we will build the park and we will do the interconnects, and you just come in and put your solar panels and you tell us how much you want to sell your price for, and then that's the deal. That model was really successful because it allowed people to manage the risks that they could manage, and also stop parties who couldn't manage risk putting a risk premium on it. So I thought that was a pretty good example, and that was a project we're very proud of. I'll put a link to that in the chat as well. So yeah, that's a great example.
Thank you very much, Steve. Anyone else would like to share?
Maybe I can come in. I think something quite recent, so you may have read in the news that Singapore and Laos has 100 megawatt of hydropower, or rather Singapore is importing 100 megawatts of hydropower from Laos through existing interconnects. I think quite challenging, because this is not just a PPP, because there are private sector governments involved, but also cross-country. But I think such projects are powerful, because these are win-win projects. Singapore needs these projects to help us achieve our net zero target. In fact, not a net zero target. We have a 4 gigawatt electricity import target by 2035, and projects like these will help support that. At the same time, we think that this will help spur some of the renewable energy investments in some of these countries, because I think as we run such projects, I'm sure there will be sufficient new renewable energy resources that will power the host countries as well, because these projects are not, small scale projects. They can be fairly large scale, and Singapore is just off taking some of it and supporting some of its funding. So I think we need to evolve the model. I think that's some way to get this to work. I think Steve is right. It's about making these projects viable, and I think the viability is can be done in two ways. Number one, making sure that there are enough off-takers, because at the end of the day, once you have enough off-takers, then the project becomes a viable one. It becomes a balance between upfront costs versus downstream recovery. And I think I don't think our region is very used to such projects in large scale way. So I think probably need a couple of good proof points, and with these good proof points, hopefully we can do more. I mean, Singapore has a MOU with Indonesia. I think both the senior ministers on both countries have signed it in March this year, and I'm hoping that through a collaboration like that, we'll be able to get more similar large scale projects between countries. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jian Wei. That story was actually the top story for our Eco-Business newsletter this week. And we are indeed seeing so many, positive initiatives in the region. And myself, I've been covering energy for like 20 years. And, the ASEAN power grid has been something that's been talked about, for a long time. And I think the regulatory environment is finally coming together. And at the same time, there's huge corporate ambition as well as demand to offtake this renewable energy. So I think the factors are all there. And perhaps there's a good segue into my next question, which is really around the business case, right? And if you look at companies and organizations who are looking to decarbonize, most of them, I think they're listed companies because of reporting standards and so on, they are compelled to already come on this decarbonization pathway. For other businesses though, they're a little bit, confused or maybe not very convinced that there is a business case, that sustainability is actually good business sense. And in this situation, what do you think moves the needles for businesses? Steve, first, I can come to you for that.
Just turned my microphone off. Sorry. I think Jian Wei's point about a carbon price, that's a very good needle to prod people with. But I think there's still a little bit of confusion thinking that climate and meeting Paris Agreement goals and achieving sustainable outcomes is a luxury, as opposed to being something that is absolutely necessary. Personally, I worry every night about that. It keeps me up at night sometimes. And it's hard, because how do you thread the needle between, the gap between what do you have to do urgently in the matter of the next 10, 20, 30 years, and keeping the wheels on and keeping the ability to deliver that. So I think we need to probably look at how we finance and how we back and how we capture money to deploy on these projects. And things like blue bonds and green bonds are a great example. I mean, if you just look at the numbers from 2019, $93 trillion global economy, $226 million worth of global debt. Well, if that's your house and that's your salary, that's pretty good. You're doing pretty well, right? So I don't think it's an issue of that there's too much debt, but what is an issue is $5.7 trillion worth of carbon for fossil fuel subsidies. So, how do we redeploy those? How do we give a guy in a family in a small rural village an electric bike as opposed to an electric powered motorbike? And how do we transition the energy monopoly and the power company and the oil company in that country onto different things? So we've got another program we're running called the Energy Transition Mechanism, which is still in development. We'll be talking about that with EMA in a couple of weeks, actually. But that's the challenge. The challenge is, how do we unlock new sources of capital, and how do we do it in a different way? And I think green bonds, blue bonds is a great start, and then helping governments gain confidence to make the change. Not everybody's Singapore, not everybody's New Zealand. You guys know what's going on, right? I can't, as you can tell from my accent, I'm not from New Zealand. So, but confidence is really important.
Thank you so much, Steve. Amelia or Ken, would you be any perspectives to add here?
No, over to you, Ken.
Yeah, so maybe I'm just too much of an optimist here, but I do think that the value of business investments in sustainability is becoming increasingly clear. There's a recent Accenture study that found that companies moving or building sustainability strategies into their digital transformation plans were 2.5 times more likely to outperform their peers. And that's not idealism, that's good business sense. I mean, I think everything that New Zealand is doing to try and build in expectations around climate risk into how we plan investments, absolutely right. We should be doing that. And I think businesses increasingly are, and that's changing the calculus. So there's good business sense behind sustainability. Increasingly, we're seeing the evidence of this. But it's not just idealism, but I do get excited by the idealism that we see, for example, from startups in this space. I know, Steve, you were going to mention some startups that you had seen in terms of waste management and sustainable consumption practices. I've had the opportunity to interact with a few examples of these, even beyond the ACCA report that I mentioned. So, one example in South Korea, for example, is a eCubes lab. They're using solar-powered trash bins that, with the help of the cloud, what they're doing is that these trash bins are smart bins. They monitor their own trash quantity. They compact them when necessary. But they've also got this machine learning algorithm that's devising what's the best route to go around and pick these up. So the waste collection efficiency is increased. And then the associated emissions with going to pick those up is reduced as well. Another example is in Indonesia, a startup called Rico System. And they're an end-to-end zero waste management business. But something I didn't think about, but during COVID-19, when more people were staying home and delivering food or having food delivered to them, along with other essentials, that resulted in a massive sudden increase in recycling and waste management needs. For a startup that was starting at that time, to suddenly have to scale operations quickly, being able to do so through cloud-enabled solutions was really important to them. And so I think these are just a couple of examples of how passionate startups using the flexibility of cloud infrastructure are able to take their limited financial resources and focus these on innovative product development and scaling solutions quickly that make good business sense and meet society-wide sustainability goals, rather than having to worry about upfront procurement and capital investment on IT hardware. So a couple more examples to add to the list. Thanks.
Super interesting. Thank you so much, Ken. At this point, I'd like to encourage our guests here to send in their questions for our panelists. And my next one is to you, Amelia. I think we've had a lot of chats about business case and what companies can do. What are some specific tools that you think organizations can harness? And I think there was also a question in the chat about sustainability data and how do we harness that?
Sure. Yeah, there's so much to do. I think the number one step I would say is you just start calculating your emissions. There are so many online calculators available. The New Zealand government has just launched a climate action toolbox this week. I'll put the link in the chat. You need to get a handle on your emissions, to be able to understand how to transition, how to do those next steps. There are a lot of estimation uncertainties there, but there are so many data providers that can help you in that space. I think also, I'll put a link again to the XRB website. We've got a lot of resources on there about calculating your emissions, about getting started on some of the trickier things about looking forward to the future, like scenario analysis. And what the intent of all of this work, is to say, what are you actually going to do about it? How is your strategy actually going to change? How is what you're doing going to change so that you can transition? So I think, transition planning, including adaptation in there, is a huge area of current interest. The UK Transition Plan Task Force has a current call for evidence out. I can put a link in the chat to that as well. It's a really great collation of current practice around transition planning, and I think that's a really good resource for people to think about, the actual practical shifts that they might need to do, and for example, how you might be able to use data and other sources. So I think really, reporting standards will help there because they help to create a comparable and a consistent benchmark for reporting entities so they can see what other people are doing, they can, use consistent data. And I really think this is an exponential area of growth. I say to everybody, because we are, in New Zealand, we are, and around the world, the disclosure requirements are requiring Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3 emissions data. And so what that means is, everybody's Scope 1 is someone else's Scope 3. And especially because banks are in these disclosure requirements, they are going to want to know the emissions data of everything that they invest in. It is going to become an absolutely fundamental piece of organizational information. And if you're not collecting it and calculating it yourself, someone is going to be out there estimating it for you. So I think get a handle on it, know what you're doing, and work to get it down so that Steve can sleep better at night.
Yes, thank you so much, Amelia. And I totally agree with you. I think, say 5 years back, perhaps there isn't so much like the plethora of tools and action toolkits that are available to organizations. And I know, from the reporting on the region that now really any organization, they just have to Google ESG data and they'll be able to find all these different things that they can, kind of capitalize. And I wanted to also give a mention to the Science-Based Targets Initiative, the SBTI, which has become a very key pathway in terms of validating listed companies or organizations decarbonization pathway. And I think the veracity of that info and the credibility is something that's super important because greenwashing is something that's also been on the rise, and lots of companies making pledges, and to be able to be genuine about that is super important.
I would totally agree. Just a little plug for assurance. XRB does assurance standards as well. At the moment, our regime only requires assurance of greenhouse gas emissions, but we know that there's a huge demand for assurance across all of this. So very, very strong push and support for entities who are looking to do any kind of reporting to be thinking about how that information could be verified by an external party.
Absolutely. Jianwei, you wanted to share?
Yeah, I wanted to say something a little bit different, I guess. Maybe not so much tools, but capability. So I think one trend I've been seeing is that I think and maybe taking a step back, sustainably sweeping across our business sectors, and actually if you think back, say 3 or 4 years ago, we just don't have that same number of people who are looking at this issue. So actually, I think making sure that we level up the capabilities of our people, our employees, or for that matter, from a government perspective, making sure that there are enough people trained in these fields are important. So at least on Singapore's front, we are looking at making sure that we have the right skill sets in people. We are talking to universities to see if, maybe not the whole course, but can there be a module about sustainability, so that's something that is useful for them. We are speaking to Skills Future Singapore, which is basically the entity in Singapore that looks at continuing education and training to see whether we can have bridging courses to make sure that more people are equipped with these skill sets. I think that's quite important, because having some vocabulary and having some of these skills will allow them to look at the issue differently. Because going back to the earlier question about what makes business sense, I think a lot of the time the business case or model will be made when the business model evolves. When the business model is the same, this becomes trying to find the point where you minimize the cost, right? So, when do I make the investment when it's the cheapest? But when you think of it differently and think, is this an opportunity? Is there a first mover advantage? Then that changes the economics and the business model altogether. And I thought having an understanding of the lay of the land, looking at the trends, etc., is important to help this business shifts. And I thought that's something that we should encourage, and I think that will help unlock the potential for net zero. Because if we can, look at the core benefits that are generated from some of these investments, then actually I think net it will be more positive than negative, even from a pure economic analysis.
Thank you so much, Jianwei. And yes, I like the word co-benefits, because you talked about how, decarbonization and digital transformation is mutually reinforcing. So I think that's is a really interesting idea. We are starting to see questions come in, and I have a question here from Simon, who is talking about coming from a country where fuel subsidy is an addiction. And so how can we convince the recipient of these subsidies, I suppose the general population, to embrace, sustainability lifestyles or policies, I suppose, even, for example, if governments are starting to remove these fossil fuel subsidies, how can we get the populace to embrace that? Steve, I think this question will be good for you.
Yeah, no need to say which country it is, but there's a couple of good choices in the region. I think if you were asking me, if I was speaking to government, I would be saying that you have a fossil fuel subsidy and you need that because the 30 to 40% of your population that you need to travel to work or travel to engage in daily life will not be able to unless you have that subsidy. Then you need to look at different modules. And people say, oh, do public transport. Well, that's not very helpful if you're in a rural area. But the other question might be, how do you look at displacing the fuel that you use? So instead of you apply a fossil fuel subsidy, but you do it for biogas, compressed natural gas or biogas, or you use it for biofuel. Now, that would be a way of moving away from and displacing fossil fuels. And that ultimately goes to this point about energy transition mechanism. The other thing to think about is who are the real beneficiaries of the subsidy? Now, I won't mention the name of the country, but it's all been in the press recently. The beneficiaries of a lot of these subsidies are not actually the poor. They're the people who drive big Mercedes and SUVs. And they disproportionately benefit from these subsidies. So another way to do it is to do a targeted subsidy where you say, okay, let's take it off from being, we're going to subsidize the cost of fuel to say we will give fuel vouchers to people. So then those people that can trade those fuel vouchers, maybe to say, I don't really need to travel for 200 kilometers this week. I'll trade it with my neighbor and I'll trade it for some fish and some cabbage. I know that sounds a bit trite, right? But it's that level of engagement that we think that model could work. And again, it's the case of not having the confidence to change it, because in some countries, if you talk about changing fossil fuels, changing fuel subsidies, the only thing that changes is your government. So it is a very, very complicated and very dangerous thing to be cavalier with. And the engagement is one issue. Consultation is extremely important. And going to Janway's point, helping to educate people on the real outcomes and to educate and create an awareness of the terms you use and democratizing that knowledge, because to a certain degree, climate change is a little bit elitist, NDCs and all this sort of stuff. The average person doesn't quite understand it. So I try as much as possible not to use that terminology, but you have to when you're in an international situation. But that's how I would do it. But again, governments have their own priorities. So we're here to help them. We're not here to tell them what to do. That's not our job. We're not telling people what to do. We try and help people. So I'll give it back to you, Jess.
Thank you so much, Steve. I think there's one question that's come in here, which I want to direct at Amelia, which is that the cost of certification and standards can be overwhelming for SMEs. And I do agree with that. There's a whole alphabet soup and you need to have in-house resources. How can the cost of compliance be subsidized?
I think it's a really interesting question, and rather than what New Zealand has done is, rather than subsidising a cost of compliance, we're actually thinking about how the disclosure requirements can be right-sized. So our disclosure standard is very principles-based. The idea is, that it will enable entities to talk about what it is that they are doing. The key thing is to provide transparent information to investors about what entities are doing, so that the investors can make, appropriate capital allocation decisions. So, if for example, an entity is not doing something, the disclosure would be, we are not doing this thing. And that provides transparent information. Now, on the cost of audits, absolutely hear you. I think it's a very good point. We have a lot of discussions in New Zealand about that. We have been thinking about, how we open the market to enable the most assurance practitioners to be able to participate in the market, because that should bring the cost down. We do not want to have a situation where it is only the big 4, big 5 accounting firms who are able to participate in this market. So we're doing a lot of work with non-traditional assurance providers in this space, because we really want to enhance capability, enhance capacity, so that there is a larger pool to draw from, so that the cost will come down, especially for assurance.
Thank you very much, Amelia. I think with an eye on the time, I'd like to wrap up with a final question for our panelists, and weaving in Junus's really good question about Asia's unique strengths as well. What do you think is next for the region? What are the pockets of optimism, or if you're really, kind of pessimistic about some things, what do you think is in store for the region? Jian-Wei, perhaps I can start with you.
I was going to say I was mulling over the question, and I was going to draw some references from where I am. So I'm in UK because I'm on a work trip to better understand how UK is decarbonizing, how they're deploying technologies. We visited some carbon capture sites, looking at some industrial clusters like Teesside, and how they incorporate the new with the old. And one thing that struck me was that they are UK is very good at taking advantage of its new endowment, its massive ability to tap on wind power and its multiple storage sites, and they are using that to decarbonize existing industries today. So when I think back about Singapore, I think Singapore is a little bit tough because we are very landlocked and we don't have that renewable resources. But if I look beyond Singapore into our region, I don't see our region being less well endowed than the UK. I mean, UK is not that big. And if you want to look at wind power, Vietnam has wind power, plenty of wind power apparently. If you look at solar power, I think many of our neighbors have the ability to deploy solar in much larger scale. So I think if you look at Southeast Asia, or even the great, and if you look at beyond Southeast Asia to the greater Asia, there's even more opportunities and even more resources. So the question is, how do we unlock the resources? How do we interoperate and make sure that we look at it as an ecosystem? I think this is where, if we look within the country, we may have a certain set of solutions, and when we look beyond the country and look around, I think there can be synergies that are between countries. I don't want to say ASEAN, because ASEAN is a very strong word, but coalition of the willing, if there are countries that are willing to come together, maybe not so much share resources, but find a way to create win-win outcomes. I think that I'm hopeful that the region will be able to decarbonize faster. I'm not sure whether it will be in the next 5 years or so, but if I look further out in the 10-15 year time frame, I think these are opportunities that I think will be very ripe to be tapped.
Thank you, Jian-Wei. Amelia, final thoughts very quickly. Yeah, on mute.
On mute. Focus on solutions. I think it's really important to bear witness to the problem that we're having, but focus on solutions. It really inspires people. It will encourage action. We're really hoping that by providing more transparent information, better data, it will encourage innovation and encourage change. So really hopeful about the future.
Thank you, Steve.
I think there are unique characteristics to a lot of Southeast Asian and North Asian civilizations, and South Asian civilizations as well. And I think the ability to let people pick up and run with the ball, Singapore's a great example of, they got their act together and it moved fast. And a lot of the other economies around the region have also used that capacity. The other factor is that there is a great deal of goodwill. And I'll use an example from COVID. I spent most of 2020 in Malaysia, and Malaysia said, we're going into lockdown and there's no hari raya. You'll have to, I'm sorry, you can't balik kampung. Very, very little, fighting about it. They said, yep, it's an emergency. We've got to respond to it. It's the right thing to do. And I think if that had been, I think that stands in contrast to other countries that had, very vociferous, me first, all about me, as opposed to it's all about us. So I think that is a strength. And I know that sounds a little bit trite, but it's not. It's a reality. I've been in Asia for 25 years. I think I can say it with confidence. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Steve. And final words, Ken.
Yeah, so I think one of the things that jumps to mind for APAC is that one of the biggest challenges is the different stages that regional economies are on in terms of their road to net zero emissions, or just generally, right? So when we think about climate change, it affects those developing economies which have the fewest resources to address the challenges with climate change the most. While those are challenges, I do think that there's also significant opportunities to leapfrog or bypass some of the mistakes that others have made. And I would just highlight that some of the most interesting and innovative decarbonizing solutions that we're seeing and that are being built in the span of months, not years, are originating from some of the most rapidly growing economies. And a good example of this is Greenco in India. This is one of the examples I'll be presented on later today. So I do hope you'll stay and listen to the very end. But you're going to hear, this is going to be a demo from Avneet Singh, who is calling from Amsterdam to show us live operations running in India, shared with all of us instantaneously who are watching this from our respective countries and locations today. But basically, they're using data to do real-time, not only big data analytics to run wind production more efficiently, but they're doing grid integration and grid systems management in real time, all via the cloud. So it helps to bridge a lot of these challenges and to accelerate innovation in really tangible and visible ways. So I do hope that you'll stay for that presentation at the very end of today's summit. But thanks to all of my colleagues here on the panel. I think this has been really interesting. Appreciate all the conversation.
Thank you so much, Ken. On that note, I'd like to echo thanks to all the speakers. I've learned so much from all of you. We've had so many interesting case studies, examples, and also insights on where Asia is heading. So on that note, thank you again, and I'll hand it back to my colleague, Junice.
Wonderful. Thank you so much to the panel. It's been fantastic, an hour. I learned so much about the great examples you all shared. And there's more to come, so please stay tuned. As Ken mentioned as well, we've got a great case study that comes at the end. But I'm going to now introduce Dr. Fraser Thompson, the principal at Alpha Beta Access Partnership. They're a key partner to AWS. They recently launched a paper, and the title is Contextualizing Cloud Sustainability. Really interesting, really insightful case study, especially in Singapore and the potential of green data centers. So without further ado, Fraser, the floor is yours.
Terrific. Thank you, Eunice, for the introduction, and thank you for having me for this discussion. I really enjoyed listening to that panel and hearing about all the challenges and innovations that are going on. What I want to do briefly is share this new research that Eunice mentioned that we have just released today, an Access Partnership. We are a global firm looking at technology issues, and Alpha Beta, we are part of Access Partnership, and we really look at the economic side. So the research that I'll share today is sort of a combination of looking at some of these big sustainability digital trends from that Access Partnership research, plus some of Alpha Beta's research, which has looked at the economic impact of these data centers. So I'm going to briefly share this PowerPoint. I hope everyone can see this clearly. Maybe Eunice, if you give me a thumbs up, is that great? Wonderful. Thanks. And I'm going to touch on three questions. The first is, why are data centers important? And why, if we take sort of a societal standpoint, why should we care about data centers, where they're located, and the services they bring? The second is, drawing on that Access Partnership research I mentioned, talk a little bit about what are some of the latest sustainability trends that we're seeing, and what does that mean for the sector? And then thirdly, I want to share some thoughts about what a sustainable development pathway for data centers could look like. An Access Partnership and Alpha Beta did a number of pieces of research on this recently, particularly in the Singapore context, which we think has broader relevance across the region. So with that, let me jump in. So first of all, the data center industry globally is a very significant contributor to GDP. Now, if you look at a few examples here, and we see that in Canada, there's this $39 billion of value added and over 5,000 jobs by 2037. You see here that in the US, you've had $4.3 billion of benefits in Virginia. In the Netherlands, you saw a number of jobs, both direct and indirect. In the UK, AWS alone is close to £9 billion of economic value. So lots of impact. In Singapore, we found that the number actually was surprisingly big. So $2.3 billion of GDP impact associated with data centers in Singapore alone. And that's gone up close to 65% just over the last 3 years. So really extraordinary growth in those numbers as well. If you look at the job side, the jobs directly, there's some jobs, there's not a huge amount of jobs. The direct operations of jobs is more capital intensive rather than job intensive. However, that kind of misses some of the labor points that data centers bring. There's also a number of indirect jobs in the supply chain, but also jobs that are associated with cloud. So cloud implementation jobs and jobs that are dependent on cloud for a large degree of their functions. So if you take the Singaporean context, for example, there may be only 7,000 people directly employed in data centers, but then you have an additional 17,000 in the supply chain jobs, another close to 500,000 jobs associated with implementation, and further jobs associated with actual operations that depend on cloud. So the jobs number is actually much bigger when we think about the broader relevance of cloud. The other aspect which often gets missed is that why data centers become particularly important in their host countries is that the world is shifting very rapidly in terms of how do we think about data flows. And increasingly, we're seeing that data as having an increasingly location-specific component to it. And that's really for two reasons. The one is that we're seeing the development of low latency services in many sectors. And basically, these are services where you can't have even milliseconds lag in the data because it's become so crucial to these applications. So when many of us think about this, we think about fintech, and think about all those applications that have low latency requirements. But that's just the start of these kind of services. As we move to the fourth industrial revolution, we look across a range of sectors, from transport, autonomous vehicles, from manufacturing, this real-time data updates, where increasingly low latency services are going to become crucial to their functioning. And then we look across different sectors. We see here in this chart that it varies. So in low latency can be up to 60% of the data in some sectors like infocom and media. And overall, it's probably about a third of data has low latency requirements. So in those cases, actually having proximate data centers becomes really, really important. The second aspect where location becomes important is if that data is sensitive and cannot be transmitted fully across borders. And so often we think about healthcare data records as something that we see that countries can actually ring fence, or sort of national defense data, for example. Things where that actual sensitivity of information and potentially through data localization means that needs to sit separately and have some kind of location proximity. So these two reasons are why data centers proximity becomes more important than just having data centers anywhere. And across the different sectors, we see that roughly 70% to 75% of data has some kind of location requirement. So either low latency or a sensitivity, which requires that data center to be much more localized. And this is important because we sometimes overlook that, thinking that, look, we can have a data center anywhere. And if you're in a country like Singapore, for example, where land is very scarce, do I really need data centers in this country? And the short answer is yes. You need it not only for the economic value add that they bring, but because it's such a crucial enabler for these kind of new data flows that are going to be so important for a range of different sectors. The other aspect where data centers become really crucial is actually around this whole sustainable development focus that we have. And it was great to hear the discussion about the importance of cloud computing for achieving the sustainable development goals, because we sometimes overlook that fact. But if you look here at Singapore's own sustainability targets, and I use Singapore just as a case study here, it's really interesting how important local data centers are for so many of those areas. So the Singapore 2030 Green Plan, you see that things like smart grids, autonomous vehicles, are a really important role for local data centers to support that low latency data requirements. Also, if we look at other things around 3D reconstruction from images, even like smart water meters, all of these have this kind of really data intensive component and also an increasingly location specific component. So data centers become really, really important for those big sustainable development initiatives that we have across a range of different sectors. So that's a bit about why we should care about data centers. What I want to share next is a survey that Access Partnership did recently, which asked executives in data centers about how they were incorporating sustainability trends into their operations. And this was interesting for a number of areas. I think the first thing that stood out is that there is increasing concern about the regulatory constraints and the restrictions that will be on data centers and the requirements to improve sustainability performance. And I guess the reason why this makes sense is that data centers are now becoming a meaningful share of energy demand. So in Singapore, it's roughly 8% of total demand is linked to data centers. In other countries, it's a slightly lower share, but still significant and growing rapidly. And because of that, now policymakers are starting to look much more closely at data centers and say, well, actually, what is the sustainability performance of these different data centers? And I think what they're realizing in many cases is that there's a very wide distribution. We've got some that are very efficient and some that are real laggards. And that creates real concerns for policymakers. The second insight that came out was the demand pull factor. So regulation is important, but it's increasingly the customers that are driving this requirement through data centers that's causing this big push in the industry to move towards greater sustainability. Third, when we look geographically, the two, if you look sort of markets of really keen interest at the moment from a data center sustainability standpoint are Africa and Southeast Asia. And Southeast Asia, probably most relevant for this conversation. We've already talked about some of the trends in the region, but this is a region which is growing amazingly quickly with incredible data demand needs, but also real challenges in that shift to sustainability and managing those carbon emissions. It's also a region, we should add, that Southeast Asia is one of the most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change and particularly sea level change, given the large share of the population that lives close to sea level at the moment in the region. The fourth is around industry associations. And I think this is an important point that increasingly data centers are looking to coordinate through industry associations to move the industry rather than just do their own single initiatives. And this is really crucial if we want to shift the entire performance of the industry. So, it may be great that AWS is moving ahead with their own sustainability initiatives and being a leader on that, but we need everyone in the industry to shift to that higher bar if we're going to see the full impact realised in sustainability outcomes. And then finally, there's some interesting aspects around how do we create more economic value and societal value out of data centres as well. So, the big numbers mentioned here, in 90% of the respondents say that sustainability is a priority for their business. 80% said that there's a major concern that they have with tougher regulations of data centers. But as I alluded to before, an even higher percentage talk about the fact that the bigger driver is really around their clients that are pushing them towards these kind of higher sustainability standards. The interesting aspect is we also ask them not only what their concerns are and perceptions, we also asked in the survey, what are the things that they're doing at the moment that are trying to push the needle on these sustainability aspects? And I just want to allude to sort of three of them here. The first one we talked a lot about already, but renewable energy. Of course, we need renewable energy at scale, connecting to these data centers. But it's not just about the primary supply. Increasingly, it's about the backup of that. And how do we make sure that we don't just have green primary supply and brown backup? And so if you look here in Singapore, we have significant amount of renewable energy that has been talked about, including the import of renewable electricity. But we still have a challenge where we still rely a lot of diesel generators. So how do we shift that to think about batteries and high density battery systems, the ultimate use of hydrogen, liquid hydrogen, for example, that can enable 100% green value chain, primary and backup. And that's a lot of the interesting research which is going on at the moment, where we see in the industry is around solving that question. So not only solving the primary, but how to also solve the primary and the backup issues that come with that. The second area is around artificial intelligence. And we talked a lot about it. I think Ken made a good point that energy efficiency has to be the starting point when we look at improving the sustainability performance of this IT infrastructure, which is exactly correct. Artificial intelligence has a really important role to play in doing this. So the ability to analyze data, understand humidity, temperature, and how to optimize that on the operations becomes really, really important. And you can't have a data center that operates in India and run it the same way as one that runs in Canada, because completely different environmental context, which will govern the operations of that data center. And there's a real opportunity to use that AI to think about how do we optimize that sustainability performance. The third area where we're seeing a lot of research going on is around cooling mechanisms. And cooling mechanisms has a big impact on the energy efficiency of these data centers. And in fact, you can reduce up to 25% in some case studies of energy use through some of that cooling mechanisms. And we're seeing some really interesting advances here in terms of using seawater to cool, as well as actually having underground offshore data centers that kind of can be naturally cooled by the seawater. Now, there's a lot of challenges with this, but a really interesting area where I think we'll see much more focus going forward. So that's a bit about some of the trends. The final bit in this presentation I just wanted to share a bit about was, what would a sustainable development pathway look like for data centers? And in our research in Singapore, we did some scenario analysis, which I think is much more broadly applicable across the region, about how do we think about the growth of data centers. And in those scenarios, we looked at 4 areas. And the scenarios are basically defined by differences in the pace of expansion of data centers. You see there on the x-axis, and the sustainability of that expansion, which is on the y-axis. And if you go from clockwise, starting with the green growth scenario, that's the best scenario that we'd like to get, where we see this rapid expansion of data centers and the benefits they bring, but it's done in a sustainable way where we're maximizing the energy efficiency focus, maximizing the renewable energy sourcing as well. The next one is around business as usual. And that's where we're on track with in most spaces at the moment, where we actually see rapid growth in data centers, but we don't have the focus on sustainability. And then increasingly we see the impacts on carbon, on water usage, etc., that comes with that. And if we don't take this opportunity now to reshape this industry, that's in many regions the kind of path that we're on. The third one is around the dual collapse. And this we use in the Singapore context, but more broadly, you could think about that you see the collapse with tight regulatory restrictions, which mean that we don't see the growth of data centers, but at the same time, because the industry is smaller, we don't see the same incentives to invest in sustainability either. So you get the worst of both worlds. You get low economic expansion and growth, but you also get that the growth that is there is still very much non-sustainable, non-green focus. And then the final scenario in the top left is around this what we call green but small. So you do see some growth of data centers, but with significant constraints on their growth. So whilst it may be sustainable, we don't see the right kind of expansion of that to support the needs that we have. And that creates issues not just from a business productivity standpoint, but as we heard earlier, it matters for the achievement of sustainable development goals and all those areas that are dependent on cloud computing. So, from this, you can see that clearly the best outcome would be, how do we get to that green growth scenario? And that's where a lot of our focus of analytics and research has been based. To give you a sense of why these numbers and scenarios become so important, here is the modeling that we did for Singapore. So a lot of numbers here, but I'll just talk you through the main insights. The first is that if you look at carbon emissions, we see that today there's 2.2 million tonnes of carbon associated with data centres in Singapore. If we were to have a business as usual growth, we're talking about a 4x increase in that by 2030. So really massive expansion. And our Singaporean government colleagues on the line would probably, their heart would flutter as they see those potential carbon increases numbers, because that's something that's definitely not in the plans from a policymaker perspective, given the targets that Singapore's outlined. Similarly, if we look at energy demand, business as usual, in that orange bar is massive growth, close to 5 to 6 times the current growth in energy demand. And similarly with economic output and direct jobs, that business as usual, it delivers in impacts, but with significant costs. So what we looked at is that green growth scenario, and it's the one on the far right of these bars. And what's interesting is we showed in Singapore's case, you could get carbon emissions by 2030 down from 2.2 million tonnes to 0.2. So almost reducing this by 95% plus of total carbon emissions by 2030. And that is a very realisable goal. In energy demand, on the bottom left, you would see an increase in energy demand, but far less than the business as usual scenario, because of using all those different energy efficiency measures, from improving the PUE, so improving the ratio of the IT equipment to the non-IT equipment, energy usage in the data centres, but also looking at cooling mechanisms, etc. If you look at the economic value added, you see a massive increase there. So from $2.3 billion today to potentially $20.7 billion in 2030. So real step change in the output, and also real step change in terms of the jobs associated with. So I guess the key takeaway from this is that these scenarios have very different outcomes in terms of economic impacts and in terms of environmental impacts. So that the real key question is, how do we shift, particularly from this business as usual path, to something that is much more sustainable for this industry going forward? And here I think there's some really interesting examples that we don't have to start from scratch. Europe has their climate charter for data centers, which is a really interesting alliance, and has a number of sort of, if you like, the building blocks of what a sustainable data center industry could look like across Asia. So part of this, they look at energy efficiency. So they put targets and requirements around PUE, so that measure of energy efficiency I mentioned earlier. And basically a lower PUE number is better, and the closer to 1 we can get it, the better. In Singapore, it's about 1.9 on average today. We believe in Singapore we could get it as close to 1.3 by 2030. If you look at clean energy, it's got requirements around increasing the share of renewable energy sourcing to 75%. It's also got requirements on water efficiency, circular energy usage from district heating, and also more broadly on the circular economy in terms of reuse of parts and recycling that goes with that. And importantly, if you see down the bottom there, there's an active review status to see how progress has been made against this. So it's not just a target is set and walk away from, it's actually the active monitoring, which, as we know, with sustainability targets becomes a really crucial part of this. So that is an interesting starting point, I think, for many countries in Asia to consider. Obviously, things would have to be adapted to the local context, but it is important that we're not starting from scratch here. The final slide I wanted to share was basically about where are the opportunities for public-private partnership here, and what are some of the innovative policies that we're seeing governments do in the region that could be scaled up more broadly. And I wanted to point to just a few examples. The first is Japan, and what they're doing on building innovation is really exciting. So they've got a $7.3 billion initiative to encourage green innovations, including data centers, and about innovations in design that could really reduce the consumption footprint in terms of water emissions, etc. The other second area is around land dedicated to data center clusters. So in China, there's actually a number of mega clusters of data centers that have been announced. And some of the benefits of this is that when you start to think of it as a cluster, you can design the back-end systems more efficiently. So some of those things like liquid hydrogen and green sustainable backup becomes much more manageable if you cluster some of these activities together. The third is around research partnerships for energy use. In Germany, they're doing a lot of really interesting research, particularly at the Fraunhofer Institute, who many of you will be familiar. The Fraunhofer Institute really is a leading body on a range of different areas of sustainability research. And they're doing some really interesting things around understanding energy efficiency opportunities, but also renewable energy and storage solutions that can help support that transition to 100% carbon-free energy. And then the fourth is around investments in land innovation. And in Singapore in 2017, there was this memorandum of understanding between Keppel and JTC to look at exploring underground data centers. And we'll see increasingly these kind of innovations of offshore, underwater, underground data centers that can kind of reduce the land footprint that goes with these operations, but also can create some benefits in terms of the sustainability of the operations. So with that, I'll stop there. I hope this was useful. I'll send the links to the research papers in the chat, but I think the main messages, as I said, is that we are data centers have a really important role to play in our economies in driving growth and also driving some of the sustainability challenges and the solutions that we need. The challenge that we have here is that many of the models of data centers are not fit for purpose. And we have a real opportunity to rethink that through public-private partnerships to drive a much more sustainable development of this sector, which will be really one of the most fundamental questions that I think we face to drive the kind of sustainability and economic growth in the region is getting this right. So I think this is such an important discussion, and I'm really pleased to be joining you. Thanks, Eunice. Back to you.
Thank you, Fraser. All right, we have kind of run out of time for questions, but if anyone wants to, get a hang of this, get a hang of Fraser and ask more questions, you can certainly do so via AWS as well. All right, and with that, I'm pleased to welcome our last panel, Scaling Energy Innovation and Cleaner Grids via the Cloud. For this final session, allow me to introduce Ms. Genevieve Ding, Head of AWS's APAC Sustainability Policy Strategy, as the moderator for the panel. Genevieve?
Thank you so much, Eunice. Thank you so much. Quint Simon spoke earlier about how AWS is not only doing a lot to make our own infrastructure sustainable and helping our customers with their decarbonization efforts, but we're also expanding our focus to how we're helping our customers help their own customers make impact at scale across their sectors. Today, we are really excited to dive deeper into how sustainability impact has been achieved at scale with some of our customers in the energy and utility sector. Joining us today, we have Annette Worth, who is the AWS Worldwide Technology Leader for Industry Solutions in the energy sector. She's calling in from Stockholm to present on behalf of Trendy in Japan, a peer-to-peer startup retailer in residential electricity. Annette also used to work at Trendy and was closely involved in their tech development. We also have Scott Gillette, Senior AWS Business Development Manager for the power sector, and he also leads the Vector AWS Strategic Alliance for Sustainability. He's calling in today from New Zealand and presenting on behalf of Vector, a power transmission and distribution company in Australia and New Zealand. Last but definitely not least, we have Avneet Singh, Senior Specialist Solutions Architect at AWS, who is calling in today from the Netherlands and presenting on behalf of Greenco, a leading renewable energies solution provider in India, where Avneet is deeply involved in their cloud solutions architecture. Our panelists will be discussing how these companies are using cloud-enabled tools and services to creatively and quickly achieve climate and sustainability outcomes with impact well beyond their own businesses. Presenters, thank you so much for joining us all today. Let's start first with Annette and Trendy. Annette, you've worked directly in Trendy and are very familiar with their story and tech development. We'd like to invite you today to share a little bit more about that journey and how, in electricity retail services in Japan, is Trendy using AWS Cloud to innovate for sustainable electricity trading? Thanks very much.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much for helping me. Let me share my screen. Does that work for you?
It's starting to load. Thanks, Annette.
Okay. Give me a hands up when it's loaded.
It's loaded.
Okay, perfect. So yeah, thanks. It's a pleasure for me to being here and present Trendy. As Genevieve mentioned, I've worked for Trendy for several years back when I was living in Japan before moving back to Europe and eventually joining AWS. but I've stayed in touch with my ex-colleagues from there and who've helped me putting this together with the latest updates. So thank you, Jeffrey and Takeda-san, if you're on the line, for helping me on this presentation. So before diving into what Trendy has done, let me just give you a very quick review on what the Japanese power market looks like today. So in 2021, the Japanese energy source breakdown still shows over 70% of fossil fuels. And that obviously created a strong energy dependence of the country, and the recent price spikes of natural resources have dearly impacted the power industry and the supply market as well. Now, there is a big effort for increasing renewables with the new targets that are 36 to 38% of renewables by 2030. This is a big increase compared to the previous target, which was 22 to 24%. And actually, the 22% mark has been reached last year already. So there is another big change that happened in April this year, which is the replacement of the feed-in tariff introduced in 2012 by the feed-in premium, which means that now if you inject renewable energy into the grid, you get not the constant tariff, but instead you get a premium on the market price, which fluctuates throughout the day. And therefore that provides a bigger incentive of diversification of renewables and also introduction of things like flexibility in batteries, for instance. Now back to Trendy. So Trendy is a startup that is a residential retailer for Japanese customers. So basically selling electricity to households. It is a spin-out from the Tokyo Electric Power Company, or TEPCO, created in 2017, headquartered in Tokyo. And since then has received investment from different corporates such as Idemitsu, Itochu, or Deva. It is a fully bootstrapped company, which means it started with 0 customers and 0 technology. So we started using third-party software in the beginning and then bit by bit rebuild it with using AWS native building blocks. And so the mission of Trendy has always been to accelerate decentralized renewables in Japan. And to get there, the strategy was to follow 3 steps. The first one being to get customers and deploy solar as quickly as possible. The second one is to introduce flexibility through storage or EVs. And the third one is then to connect them by enabling peer-to-peer energy sharing between consumers and producers of electricity so that they can exchange electricity between them. All these 3 steps are powered by what is called the utility suite, which is basically the backend that manages all the data coming from the various sensors and also the billing. And I'll get back to more in details of what exactly that is. Now on step 1, the Trendy has released a product, Hotta Denki, which eventually was renamed and adapted to Hiramari Denki with that change in regulation to the feed-in premium. But basically, it offers rooftop solar for free to customers. And it uses an approach similar to power purchase agreement, PPAs, or third-party ownership, where Trendy is basically financing, installing, maintaining, and owning the panels on the roofs of the customers and selling the electricity straight to the customers. The excess energy is sold fed back into the grid, and Trendy manages the paperwork for that. Now that's an advantage for the customer because the customer just pays the electricity bill the same way as before with a discount on it. And Trendy, when they sell electricity from the roof directly to the customer, you don't have to pay transmission or distribution fees. Now, the second step is introducing battery storage. And for now, Trendy has 2 offerings, Maru Maru Denki and Kokoro Denki, that are made in partnership with Itochu and Sharp, that again offers batteries for 0 upfront cost to the customers, usually in combination with solar panels. And the third step is the peer-to-peer energy trading, and I'll spend a little bit more time on that. This is not yet a product, but we started very early on building a proof of concept for this, involving 20 households, 9 plug-in hybrids, 6 home batteries, and an office solar. It was done in collaboration with Toyota and the University of Tokyo. And here there's a picture of one of the early meetings. I think it was back in 2009. And if you look really well, you can spot me in there. So there's several press releases and papers that have been published on that, that you can find online or reach out to me or any trendy folks. I'm sure we're happy to share with that. So it's a POC that was running a bit over a year from June 2019 to 2020. Let me explain you a little bit more in depth how it was working. So you've got the physical layers and the information layer. On the physical layer, you have the households that are some of them equipped with PV, some with batteries, some with plug-in hybrids, connected together through the national grid and the low voltage national grid. You also got an office and plug-in hybrids where employees could charge their cars at work, basically, which is connected to the high voltage market. Now, all the households and the cars are equipped with agent, as well as the office and also the grid itself. And these agents now predict their needs for the day ahead and their energy needs. And then they can bid to buy or to sell electricity on the local energy market. The local energy market is built on blockchain and smart contracts, and basically it uses a continuous auction mechanism to match the buy and the sell orders, very similar to what the electricity market as a whole is doing. I'll jump directly to the results of this experiment. You see at the bottom here the electricity bill reduction, and it highly varies depending on what type of users you are, if you're equipped with solar, PV, or with batteries. But on average, everyone decreased the bills, and on average, it was 8.6%. You can also see on the top charts that during daytime, over 75% of the electricity that was sold by the prosumer agent, which means from their solar panels. And that renewable energy was then consumed mostly by the consumer and the car agents, but sometimes also fed back into the grid. We have calculated that 43% of the charging was actually from solar, whether it is from rooftop solar or from the office solar. So it was a really big success. And we're back now, how does that relate to AWS? Well, as I mentioned before, it relates on all the steps because all the 3 steps were built on AWS. Powering the utility suite. And so the utility suite is basically the backend, the software package that combines customer management, demand supply management, billing, meter data management, and now also the peer-to-peer energy trading. And it is used for managing the internal customers of Trendy. It was built on AWS Cloud Native using many building blocks that you can see on this diagram. I won't go in details on that. And the idea is that once this utility suite becomes mature enough and has been tested on on Trendy's customers themselves, that you can also offer this as a software package to third parties so that they can start innovating and using rooftop solar or peer-to-peer energy trading. As for the peer-to-peer trading architecture, that was also built on AWS, and this time using serverless technology. For instance, the home agent is containerized on Fargate. And that means the reason for that was that even though now it's running in the cloud for POC and for being able to be debugged more easily, in the future, you could deploy this home agent directly in the home energy management system of the customers, and therefore on the edge side, which is a lot more scalable and allows to have the computing power directly on the edge. There is also a case study that was released together with AWS on this that you can find on this link. Unfortunately, it's only in Japanese as of now, but there's a lot of translation services that do a really good job. So have a look. This is my final slide. So what are the lessons learned? Well, I think energy startup life is generally a very rocky life, especially in the last few months with the energy spikes. what we've seen also in general is that despite the improvements in terms of sustainability goal, Japan is still somewhat lagging behind in the ambitiousness of some of the European or North American countries. But in general, what we see all over the world is that there is an important need to foster also these decentralized energy management solutions in order to exploit renewable energy more efficiently, especially when it goes above a certain percentage of the supply. And that's where digitalization is really a crucial step in order to manage distributed solar, batteries, EV, and all the data that comes in and has to be dealt with in real time. And the cloud provides the building blocks for that. So it really enables startups like Trendy to enter this market that generally has really high barriers to enter, but also then to scale from a small number of customers to a bigger number of customers, and to try out new business model, trial and fail, try fast and fail fast idea. But in order for them to try out business model, of course, you need the right policies. And it's really that which drives innovation and that drives startups to try out things and to accelerate the path for renewables and reduce energy dependence. So I really think that if you have the right goals and the right policies with tech-savvy utilities and startups combined with cloud solution, that's the path for scaling sustainability and innovation in general. So that's it from my side. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Annette. That was really very insightful. And it's so fascinating and heartening to see how startups can potentially chart the path for moving the needle in Japan's energy transition. Let's now move on to Vector in Australia and New Zealand, countries which are likely harbingers of what is to come in clean energy for countries like Japan and others in APAC. Scott, in power grid management in Australia and New Zealand, can you tell us a little bit more about how Vector is using AWS IoT, ML, and big data analytics, and how this has helped to facilitate efficient grid management and greater integration of clean energy at scale? Thanks very much.
Certainly. Hi, and welcome from Auckland, New Zealand. While the picture is sunny, it's now getting quite late here, so unfortunately the sunset has well and truly passed. My name is Scott Gillette. I'm part of the Amazon Web Services team in New Zealand. I've been working with Vector since around about 2016 on the digital journey. And in addition, I lead an alliance that is building next generation technology to solve some of the challenges that we've been talking about today. New Zealand is actually in a unique position, and it's been referenced a number of times in that we were an early investor in renewables-based generation, particularly hydroelectric and geothermal, and then more recently wind. In 2017, 82% of the electricity generated in New Zealand came from renewable sources, with our government targeting 100% renewable generation by 2035. And as a country, New Zealand has a net zero carbon emission target for 2050. But to achieve these targets, in addition to governmental work and industry work, there are new technologies and approaches to generating, to distributing electricity, and to managing, how customers interact with their energy that are required for New Zealand's electricity infrastructure, and in fact are required all around the world to address, the common themes of decarbonisation of the energy ecosystem. So today's session really covers the work progressed with Vector since 2016 on its digital and cloud transformation journey. I'll be talking through the kind of challenges that they see, how they've approached solving those challenges with technology and other parts of their business, and how they're contributing to accelerating the move towards 100% renewable energy in New Zealand and also contributing globally. So in the discussion today, I'll be covering three areas. Firstly, I'll be introducing Vector for those not familiar, the challenges in that business, their sustainability drivers. Then I'll be sharing the strategy that Vector have set out to address those challenges. That strategy is called Symphony. And thirdly, I'll be speaking about the AWS and Vector digital and cloud journey, and particularly the strategic alliance that's been formed with Vector to build some new technology we see needed to really unblock some of those big challenges. And this is Auckland. Vector, as a company, operates the electricity distribution grid in this region that you see on screen. And it's an area that accounts for around about 35% of the population of New Zealand, and it accounts for approximately 30% of the country's GDP. It's interesting. Auckland is one of the fastest growing cities in the OECD in terms of population. As a region, the electricity grid has to deal with those two large harbours that sort of bisect the city and cut it in two. You probably can't see it, but just out in that harbour, just a bit up into the north, there's a volcano. There's about 53 volcanoes, mostly extinct, luckily, in the Auckland area. There's around about 30 islands up in the sort of top right, which are actually populated. And out to the west there, there's a rainforest that essentially separates the towns out along that coastline from the main CBD, which has its own challenges. And in addition, Auckland, which is quite different from Singapore, is actually one of the most least densely populated cities in the developed world. And so this ecosystem, or this environment, creates some really unique challenges around implementing very resilient grid infrastructure in a manner that's cost effective, but also environmentally sustainable. From a business perspective, there's also a number of challenges that Vector have had to face. Firstly, there's a real shift in New Zealand. New Zealanders are quite environmentally conscious, and there's a real shift towards the adoption of renewables-based energy, and the adoption of electric vehicles in homes, battery and solar, for instance, as people want to make better choices around where their energy comes from. Secondly, from a distribution network perspective, there is both that very, very high population growth I talked about, but there's also a government strategy and a sector strategy to decarbonize transport, both commercial and residential. The third real major set of challenges are that there are a lot of new technologies and a lot of new models appearing in the market. Vector sees those new technologies as really an opportunity to help engage with those technologies and really lead the transformation of the industry. And then fourthly, Vector is dealing with the impacts of climate change. We're seeing some quite severe weather events in Auckland, perhaps not to the same extent as Australia. We're having to adapt to those around how we design our grids infrastructure. And then, we are working very closely, or Vector's working very closely with the regulator in New Zealand around how to help transform our regulatory structure to cater for the new technologies and new business models that are emerging. Just deep diving, I think, on one really interesting data point in Auckland, or in New Zealand actually, is the uptake or the increase in electricity demand versus population growth. It is predicted that electricity demand growth will outstrip population growth by as much as 3 times, depending upon the growth forecast on demand. The demand is driven primarily by the electrification of transport and the decarbonisation of any energy source in New Zealand, which is targeted to shift onto the grid. This kind of growth in energy demand requires greater levels of generation of electricity, but also requires greater levels of distribution capacity to keep pace with that demand. The key thing that Vector acknowledged is that if they were to simply apply traditional asset investment approaches to this problem, build out new infrastructure, new grid assets, new poles and wires, they'd be required to invest significant capital infrastructure, which ultimately gets passed on to consumers in the form of the prices that they pay. And so in order to meet that demand growth and the electrification of energy onto the grid, and to maintain affordable prices and sustainable energy, Vector recognized that new technologies are required around how the grid is designed, built, and operated, rather than just building more poles and wires. And that different response can be summarized here. And so what you're seeing on the left there is essentially a forecast of how that demand growth would shape in terms of capital investment into the Auckland region. And essentially, without changing the way that Vector operates its grid based on 2.5 times peak demand growth, which is what's forecast, that the growth in electricity demand would result in 2.5 times peak demand growth, which would require a huge amount of investment in the network to deliver the resiliency and that capacity out to the homes. And you can see in that diagram, you can see that EV uptake makes up a significant portion of that peak demand on the network. The Symphony strategy, which is really taking an active role around how the grid is managed, means that Vector would engage with customers and customer equipment at the edge of the network to actively manage that peak demand requirement. By actively manage things like EV control, electric vehicles, hot water load control, and batteries, which are present at edge with our customers and the industrial organizations, Vector can look to shift peak demand into an off-peak point, reducing that peak demand, between sort of 6 to 7 p.m. at night, and therefore reduce the requirement to increase the core capacity of the network, which ultimately is there to serve peak demand in those peak periods. Through implementing Symphony, Vector see that they can limit peak demand growth to around 1.5x, which is significant in terms of the reduction in capital expenditure under that sort of scenario. And so through building this kind of technology to really manage how consumers are interacting with technology and how the grid is operated, Vector can significantly decrease the capital expenditure and thus the price of electricity to customers. And that's the Symphony strategy. So really, Symphony is an intersection of customer engagement and helping customers make great energy choices, and then also secondarily the energy assets, making best use of the energy assets on the network. But it's also intelligent digital platforms that provide that intelligence around how those new energy resources appearing on the grid can be seen, can be managed, and can be optimized to really reduce that peak demand, which drives that expenditure. And so the Symphony is really the digital and cloud transformation that sort of underpins the digital platform side of that three approach strategy. And so the next sort of slide will take you through how Symphony has been delivered within the Vector business since really 2016. So what you're seeing here is the traditional electricity supply chain, generation, core transmission into the distribution networks and out to the homes and commercial businesses. This model's been around for a significant amount of time and enabled very stable planning and capital investment planning. The problem or the challenge is what's appearing now on the grid. So in the home, we're seeing EV chargers, we're seeing solar, we're seeing batteries, we're seeing hot water, and then right throughout the grid, we're seeing all these new type of distributed energy resources attaching in the form of big battery installations, in the form of industrial solar, and even in the form of things like public EV charging networks. The second major change has actually been climate change. So in Auckland, we've seen an increase in some of the events. 2018 saw a storm, that 1 in 100-year storm that took out around about 30% of the connections into the electricity grid, and some of those customers actually stayed off electricity for weeks, as those power lines and all that infrastructure was repaired. And so the storm demonstrated to Vector how important it was to not just focus on how it manages the grid, but also how it engages the customers and helps manage these kind of events. And so part of that journey really started with Vector looking at all the touch points onto its supply chain, onto the way it engages with customers, and onto the way it manages those sort of faults. And Vector deployed a cloud-based strategy, including an outage-based application that was able to sort of scale from nothing using cloud up to a 100-year peak kind of weather event, manage all those faults, and then scale back down to run optimally as a very sustainable based solution to kind of hit that peak kind of load. Vector also deployed Data Lake, identifying that sort of those business insights was critical to decision making. And with, I guess, data and the customers well understood and well managed, Vector then moved on to its core platforms. We've heard a lot of talk about distributed energy resources appearing on the grid. Well, Vector deployed a DERMS platform in cloud back in 2018, connected back into their SCADA infrastructure. In order to increase capacity to manage their core grid, Vector have deployed a General Electric ADMS solution into AWS Outposts, which is a sort of cloud deployed onto the premise at Vector's own premises in Auckland. And really to finish part of their cloud transformation and look at what's happening behind the meter to get that visibility to really change how the grid is operated and managed. That's where the strategic alliance with AWS has come in, which is what I work with. And so in 2020, we announced the New Energy Platform Alliance, which really is a cloud-native big data platform to draw all that data off the meters, off all the low voltage sensors, to supply that through to retailers, to other distributors, to really help them, understand how customers are operating and helping them to make better choices, and then help those distributors optimize how they build, manage, and then deliver the grid to achieve sustainable outcomes rather than just sort of spending hugely on trying to keep up with peak demand growth. And this alliance is unique. Vector and AWS have established joint engineering teams in Auckland, really looking to bring together Vector's domain expertise in this future of energy with AWS's engineering expertise in building hyperscale technology. And together we're building some of the building blocks that are going to solve these sort of energy challenges. And really just to conclude, I guess, lessons from Vector's journey and the journey we've had together. The first one is leadership from the top, a desire to change, a desire to innovate and experiment, and creating the space for people to experiment, in the same way that Trendy has been experimenting is really key to learn and then scale those technologies up to deploy them, right across the grid to really affect change in how electricity is managed. Second one is people, process, and technology. It's not a technology problem, it's all three. And you need to think about culture, creating the kind of processes for experimentation, and then how those teams can move and scale up to be able to build and deploy and operate those next generation technologies that's really going to change how the grid can be operated. I talked about the ability to experiment, the funds, the people, the space, the acceptance that sometimes things will fail, but often through failure comes great learnings. And then really finally, the big learning is if you want to accelerate sustainability and sustainable outcomes in a business, you really need to be innovating and experimenting and being at the forefront of looking at all these different technology options and working out which is the right mix of innovation, for your particular geography, your market, and your particular organization. Thank you very much on behalf of Vector and AWS. It's a real pleasure to have had the opportunity to talk about Vector's story. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Scott. That was really insightful, especially the learning point on how if you want to accelerate sustainability, you really have to innovate. I know we're running late by a couple of minutes, but I would highly encourage everyone to stay till the end of Avneet's presentation. I promise you you'll be worth it. He's got something exciting in store for us. So now let's speak to Avneet on innovation in India for accelerating decarbonization through digitalizing and decentralizing energy solutions. Avneet, please.
Thank you. Good evening, good afternoon, wherever you are in part of the world. Can you all hear me okay?
Yes, very good.
Okay, wonderful, great. So I'm just going to start sharing my screen. Yes, sorry. Okay, can everyone see my screen? It's the
yes,
title.
Looks good, Avneet.
Oh, okay, wonderful. Thank you so much. Hi everyone. So my name is Avneet. I'm the EMEA Senior Specialist Solutions Architect based out of Amsterdam in the Netherlands. Currently focusing on sustainability and the sector for renewables. I've been AWS for close to 2.5 years now. I'm based out of Amsterdam, but I go wherever the work takes me. I work with customers all over the world, from North America to UK to Asia. I'm very happy and honored to be presenting on behalf of one of our esteemed customers called Greenco, which are based out of India. And I've been working with them for close to 1.5 years now, and it's been an awesome journey. We have been able to take them from a position where they hardly had any infrastructure on the cloud. They were completely on premise, to right now where they have where they've actually committed to move their entire fleet of renewable assets to AWS. And towards the end of the session, I'll be giving you a quick demo on what we have actually done and achieved for them. So I prepared for us this short agenda to help us navigate through the session. In the first part, I will introduce the customer Greenco and talk about the AWS REAO, or Renewable Energy Asset Optimization Architecture. We'll talk about an inherent problem that we face with this industry across the world. In the second section, I'll give an example of what can go wrong. And this it's about an event which happened in India, which really was, let's say, a wake-up call for the Indian government and industry as to what can be the impact if there is a problem in the balance of power with regard to the grid. And towards the end, I will talk about the Greenco's integrated renewable energy storage project, the IRESP, which is one of the first in the world. And finally, I'll give you a demo of the AWS and Greenco IoT solution that we have built with them. So who is Greenco? Greenco is the largest operator and owner of renewable assets in the country. They operate in the 15 states of India, have a total installed capacity of 7.5 gigawatts, and you can see the breakup of their fleet on your screen. They are based out of Hyderabad, which is located here in the center of India. Most of their assets are located here. They are also part of the country's green energy corridor. So the Green Energy Corridor was a scheme that was launched by the Indian government a couple of years ago, that is aimed at the synchronization and the evacuation of renewable energy with the national grid. And by far, Greenco is the largest contributor to the Green Energy Corridor. As of now, they have close to electrified 6.3 million households and have reduced approximately 17 million tons of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. So this is the AWS conceptual architecture for the renewable energy asset optimization. I have had great success with this slide when I speak to customers all over the world. There is no need to be scared. There is no name of technology here. So as you can see, you will not find a data center or a MySQL database. That is not the intention. The intention of this slide architecture is to showcase to you the journey of the data as it makes its way from the asset sitting in the field on the extreme left, which is point number 0, all the way to the extreme right, where it starts to bring value to the customer and the stakeholders. So on premise, when I say the assets at the edge, these can be wind turbines, these can be solar panels, these can be toys. It does not make a difference because AWS and IoT technology is agnostic to the asset in the field. As long as it is able to send data to us, we can talk to it. So that is step number 0, which is the source of the data. It is going to enter the cloud at from the port of entry, something known as the data ingestion engine. And these can be one of the AWS IoT technologies like IoT Core or Sitewise. But the key component here is that the moment your data enters the cloud, it begins to deliver value, and you are able to extract value from that data. For example, from the port of ingestion itself, you can create a live dashboard. So immediately as the data has come into the cloud, with minimum amount of latency, you can get real-time situational awareness. The data ingestion engine can also talk to third-party external data pools, for example, ERP systems like SAP or Oracle, or it can even talk to systems regarding weather data. So the data can actually be enriched. The ingestion engine can also send out alerts because it keeps on monitoring the status of the most important tags and metrics which are coming from the asset. And if it identifies that an event is about to occur, it can immediately send an alert in the form of an SMS or an email to the people on the ground so that they can prepare and they can be aware that something is going to happen. So real-time alerting is always possible. It is also the primary source of hydration of the industrial IoT data lake, which you see in the center here. So here in the IoT data lake is where the data is going to be cleaned, is going to be harmonized. It is going to act as the single version of truth of data for the entire organizations. You will be surprised to know that I have talked to so many customers and they have given so many examples of where their internal organizations are kind of fighting with each other as to who has the version of truth of the data. So this is going to solve that problem. There is no longer data sitting in silos. No one has their own version of the data in a SQL database somewhere. Everyone will take a chunk of the data from the data lake if they want to work with it, and the data lake becomes the version of truth for the organization. It is also going to be the primary source of any BI tools. So if you are using tools like Tableau or ClickSense or QuickSight, business intelligence reporting is also going to be fed off the data lake. AI and ML workloads, because for any AI ML workloads, you need to have a very strong repository of data on which the models can be trained. The data lake is going to serve that purpose as well. And finally, for all internal and external stakeholders, which are going to utilize their data, they will have to fetch it. They will have to fetch it from the data lake. And what we are trying to do here is, with this architecture, we are doing real-time asset monitoring and optimization. We want to optimize the cost that our customers are spending on operations and maintenance. We want to maximize production capacity, and we completely want to eliminate data sitting in silos. And at the end of all this, you might ask yourself, does this actually work? It's nice to see it on paper. Well, yes, it does work, and we have built it out for Greenco, and you'll see that shortly in the next couple of slides. Okay, now an inherent problem that we have with the renewable industry is what you see on your screen. The wind is not always blowing and the sun is not always shining. There's nothing we can do about it. Yeah, and we have to deal with this problem. And yeah, how do we deal with this problem? If there is no sun, if there is no wind, how do we get energy on demand, which is also green in nature, which is also renewable in nature? Now, usually what happens is, when we talk about energy on demand or when we talk about energy storage, we think about battery farms. So, okay, if we need to get energy on demand, we will go to the battery farm, which can then schedule the data. Sorry, which can then provide us with the delta of energy. The challenge there is the battery farms are also using hydrocarbons. So because the acid in the batteries, it is based upon hydrocarbon. It is not green in nature. It is not renewable in nature. So it is like almost almost saying taking 3 steps forward and 1 step backward. So there is a bit of a challenge over there. But Greenco has been able to solve that problem. Before going there, let's talk about what can go wrong. So this is exactly what happened in the year 2012, when the state of Uttar Pradesh, which you see over here in the center. Uttar Pradesh is the largest state in India with regard to population. And it was a very hot summer evening on July 31st and 30th. And the state demanded more than what it was allowed to get. Usually when that happens, they will have an outage, there will be a trip. But for some reason, that request went to the grid. And of course, that amount of electricity was not there. So the grid tripped and the request went to the next state, which is the one over here called Uttaranchal. Uttaranchal is a small hill state. It can never supply the energy demands of a large state like Uttar Pradesh. So it also tripped. And then it had a complete cascading effect, one state after the other. And within a few hours, half of the country was paralyzed. 600 million people of the planet were without electricity. 50% of the population of India and 9% of the world population. This was by far the most significant outage in the history of the world, which impacted the maximum number of people. It lasted for almost half a day, 15 hours, and it took 15 hours for 80% of the service to be restored. The impact was such that railways, airports, stock exchanges, everything shut down. The tax season, which usually ends by August in India, was extended by a month to September. I remember the day I was sitting here in our office and for my customer Ascent, and my colleagues, they were reaching out to me and they said, maybe war has broken out in India. I said, what? War in India? And because they said that the half of the grid is down and the news channels are completely overrun with information that there is no electricity and the airports have shut down. So this is an indication of what can go wrong if there is a sudden demand of energy, of electricity, and if that demand cannot be met, then a 100-year-old grid can really collapse, and that is exactly what happened. But now just imagine if that delta that was demanded by the state of Uttar Pradesh, imagine if we wanted 300 megawatts of extra energy, if that energy could be available, then this problem would not have occurred. And that is the kind of problem that Greenco is trying to resolve in a completely renewable way. And they do that by this project that they are building, that's called Integrated Renewable Energy Storage Project, which is the world's first largest gigawatt scale project, which combines all three economies of the renewable sector: wind, solar, and hydro. And this is how it works. So what happens is on the days when you have a surplus of energy in the grid, when the wind is blowing and the sun is shining, water is going to be pumped up from a lower reservoir to an artificially built upper reservoir. Okay, and this is always happening when you have an additional amount of electricity in the grid. And when there is a demand of electricity, when there is a delta, imagine if a state is demanding more electricity, water is going to be released from the upper reservoir, which is going to flow down. It is going to run a hydro turbine, which is then going to generate the electricity, and that is going to be pumped back into the grid. So we are also storing electricity in a green and renewable format. And at any point in time, if there is a demand of electricity, the reservoir can be opened and the demand of the grid can be met. Now, again, this looks good on paper, and you might ask yourself, is this actually happening? Well, yes, it is actually happening. So what they have done is they are doing green generation, wind, solar, and hydro, and they have been able to create a gigantic green battery in the form of renewable storage as well. So the complete part of the energy value chain, which is generation and storage, is now completely renewable and green in nature. They have gone ahead and they're actually building it out. So Greenco's largest IRESP is being built in the city of Kurnool in the state of Andhra Pradesh with a capacity of around 5,000 megawatts, and it is going to be ready for production by end of the year. I was with Greenco last week, and I was very happy. They actually took me to the site visit of this plant where it is being built, and these are some of the pictures. So on the left hand side, we have got the power station. On the right, you have got the picture of the lower and the upper reservoir. This picture of the upper reservoir at the bottom was actually taken by me from my own cell phone like 2 weeks ago. So this is actually happening in reality. It is no longer something on a piece of paper. It is not something which is being ideated, which is being vetted. They have gone ahead. They have got the approval. The government is supporting it, and they actually have approval to build this across 5 states of India, and this happens to be the one which is the largest, and it's going to be operational by end of next year. They have also been able to identify a complete market size for this new technology. They have estimated that by the end of next year and by 2 years from now, they will have an installed capacity of 100 gigawatt hours of storage, which can be fulfilled on demand. And they have identified various sectors in the market where these kind of engagements can actually happen. So yeah, this is the potential size of the market that they're targeting. At the beginning, it's going to be around 100 gigawatt hours. It will slowly expand to 25 and eventually reach 5,000 gigawatt hours of on-demand power, as in when it is needed for the grid. Okay, now I'll give you a demo of the AWS IoT solution. So just a minute. Okay, so can you all see my screen?
Yep.
Great. So this is what we call the Greenco landing page, and from here you can monitor the entire wind fleet of Greenco. So as of now, you can see that 1,200 wind turbines are actually online, out of which 1140 are online. When I say 1140 are online, it means that the blades are spinning and 15 are waiting for the wind to pick up. These bars that you see here, they actually represent the 7 states of India where Greenco has their assets. And if you hover over them, it can tell you what is the actual power output of the state of Andhra Pradesh, what is the expected power. PLF stands for performance load factor. What is the performance of my fleet at the moment? It is at the moment 32.06%. That is because the complete set of wind turbines have not been migrated to the cloud. It's still a work in progress. Out of the 2,300, 1,200 are on the cloud right now. If you go inside the cluster, you can see a breakup of each and every state. How is that state actually performing? What is the PLF? What is the wind speed? What is the actual power? Let me go inside the state of Andhra Pradesh. And now it is telling me how many plants are inside the state of Andhra Pradesh. If I go, let me click on Axis here. So Axis, one of their large plants in Andhra Pradesh, which has close to 50 wind turbines. And this is a real-time dashboard that you get for the wind farm. It is telling you what is the actual power versus expected power versus the wind speed. The actual power is shown by the green line, the expected by the blue line. We always want the actual and expected to be very close to each other, or at least the actual power to be above. And as you can see, it's doing really well. It is completely in line with what we expect. But here is the awesome thing. See, if you see right now, the time in Amsterdam is 9:41 a.m. And if you see the latest entry that I have here, it is for 9:40. Okay, so it is near real time. The latency is less than 1 minute. So this information is being sent from a renewable asset in the middle of India to the AWS Mumbai region, which is being accessed by me, let's say halfway across the world in Amsterdam, with a latency of less than 1 minute. Less than 1 minute. And I was able to drill down all the way from the top to the level of the enterprise, all the way down to the state, to the wind farm, and actually to the asset. And from here, I can even select any one wind turbine, and immediately the dashboard is going to refresh, and it's going to tell me how that particular wind turbine, in this case wind turbine T05, is doing. And if you see, yeah, it is 9:42 here, 9:42.25, and time here is 9:42. So the latency is less than 1 minute. 2 weeks ago, I was at a session in Dallas, in the US, where I was having the same demo. I was even 1,000 miles more further from India, but even then the latency remained the same. So irrespective of where you're located in the world, whether in Singapore or Japan or in Amsterdam, any part of the world, you can access the situation of this asset with a latency of less than 1 minute. And this entire thing is running on the cloud. It is completely on the cloud, running on AWS. Um, Also, we can do real-time analytics. So this is a dashboard of the past 14 days, which can tell us how a certain wind farm is performing. You can see here that Saroja wind farm was doing okay, but on 16th, the performance went down. You can investigate this. You can look at the power curve, and you can see that the blue line is actually below the red line. So something was going wrong with the wind farm. You can also see that wind turbine number 049 was giving a problem. You can select that wind turbine KST 049, and you can immediately see that something was really wrong. The blue line is below the red line. It is not doing what it is supposed to do. And then the people on the ground can actually do the proper investigation. They can do triage. They first monitor the pitch angle. I mean, to the trained eye, he can immediately identify that something is wrong with this chart, and they can take action. They can also take a look at the scatter chart, look at the temperature of the nacelle, the radiator, the winding, and see do they see something wrong. And first they will try to fix it by themselves by changing the pitch of the blade. But in case if they're not able to do it, then they are actually going to call somebody on the ground who will then walk to the asset and see what has to be done. So everything here that you see has been built on the cloud. It is running on Amazon Web Services. The cost is extremely competitive compared to what Greenco was doing earlier. And we can easily replicate the same model to customers across the world, which we are doing now. So yeah, and in this way, as you can see, Green Cove is trying to completely, trying to decarbonize the grid, and they really want to contribute towards the decarbonization and meet the climate goals of the country by 2035. So yeah, that's about it. I know we're out of time, but please,
Thank you so
if you
much,
have any
Avneet.
questions.
That was incredible. I especially loved your demo at the end. Green Code's really pushing boundaries as a pioneer in this space at scale. I'm so glad that you're part of this. Today, that brings us to the end of our Sustainability Summit today. I'd like to thank all of our presenters and panelists today. It has been a real privilege to have you join us today. As Minister Makishima said, it's really about changing mindsets, and achieving a green society should not be seen as a constraint on economic growth, but instead a measure of transformation. Similarly, today, we've heard from different perspectives on how the twin transitions of digitalization and decarbonization are in fact truly beneficial. Digital transformation and sustainability are an inseparable pair. Governments have a role to play. We heard today how governments across APAC have committed to increasingly ambitious climate ambitions. We saw in Japan how regulatory reforms and renewables helped expand offshore wind power. Governments, however, cannot do this alone, and the Asia-Pacific region can benefit from collaborations between government and industry to achieve green transformation and inclusive growth for all. From the panel on reaching net zero emissions, we heard about the importance of public-private partnerships to make climate projects bankable, and also about how technology-enabled solutions supported by the World Bank and the Asian Development Bank on everything from waste management to locating climate infrastructure. Last, about how cloud can help countries achieve sustainable development goals, extending to the S, social, and G governance parts of ESG. Businesses have a major role to play. Cloud service providers like AWS are doing everything we can to decarbonize their own operations. However, a far greater opportunity for scaling sustainability outcomes is through and with our customers, and helping them in turn help their customers. We have confidence that governments and businesses across countries in APAC can turn these parallel challenges into mutual opportunities by harnessing digitalization to meet pressing climate commitments. I would like to thank the whole team behind the scenes led by Olivia, Jamie, Malika, and Monique for their incredible hard work on this. We really appreciate it. Thank you all once again for joining us, and I hope you found today's sessions both informative as well as a call to action. Thank you so much.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, everyone, for staying tuned, through, even though we've passed a little bit over time. I know a lot of you have sent messages to say you'd like to get a hang of hold of the slides. Absolutely. And we will be following up with a post-event report, rather email report. So do look out for that. And of course, if you don't receive it, you can always email ourselves at EcoBusiness or AWS as well. Okay. All right. Thank you, everyone, again, and have a wonderful afternoon. Bye.